The worst decision of my life was to agree to go on one last family vacation before telling our kids we were getting divorced. When this happened, I had already decided to leave Darien after years of feeling ignored and slowly erased in my own home. The separation was my decision, and I had accepted that it would hurt, but I believed it was the healthiest choice for our children in the long run. When I told him I wanted a divorce, he reacted in a way that confused me because he did not shout or beg. He just listened and spoke in a controlled tone about timing and responsibility. A few days later, he brought up the mountain trip we had planned months earlier, and he insisted that canceling it would punish the kids for something that was not their fault. He repeated that we could separate after the vacation and that we would tell the children gently step by step so they would not feel like their world collapsed in one day. I hesitated because something about his calm persistence felt forced, but I agreed because I did not want my children to lose that trip along with everything else. The cabin was isolated and surrounded by trees, and once we arrived, the silence felt heavier than I expected because there was no nearby houses and no phone signal. The first day passed without obvious problems, and Darien acted almost cheerful as he helped unpack and cooked dinner. That night, after the kids were asleep, he sat with me in the kitchen and started talking about fixing our marriage as if my decision was temporary. I told him clearly that I was done. And although I stayed calm, I noticed the way he studied my face while I spoke. He leaned back in his chair and said that being away from the city would give us time to think without distractions, and he emphasized that isolation could be good for us. The way he said that made me uneasy, but I told myself I was overreacting and that this week would simply be uncomfortable. The next morning, he suggested a hike, and after we returned, I saw him lock the door and check the windows carefully, which felt unnecessary but not alarming. I went into the bedroom to unpack the last bag, and that was when everything shifted. On the bed, there was a duffel bag left open, and inside, I saw thick rope, rolls of duct tape, and a metal bat placed neatly on top. My heart began racing, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. When he appeared in the doorway, he saw exactly what I had found. Instead of denying anything, he closed the door behind him and locked it. And he told me in a low voice that I was not supposed to see that yet. I asked him what the bag was for, and he walked toward me with a calm expression. We were not ending this family because you had decided to give up. When I tried to move past him, he grabbed my wrist and twisted it sharply. He pushed me onto the bed and used his weight to hold me down, and even though I struggled and tried to roll away, he tied my wrist tightly behind my back and secured my ankles. He kept repeating that this was temporary and that he just needed time to make me understand. He taped my mouth shut and dragged me into the living room where my kids froze when they saw me tied up on the floor. They started crying immediately, asking what was going on, and he told them that Mommy was confused and needed help remembering what mattered. He forced them onto the floor and tied their wrists while they begged him to stop, and he did it with the same focus he had shown in the bedroom. There was a pause after he finished tying them, and in that silence he stood still, breathing slowly as if considering his next step. That pause filled the room with a tension so strong that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. He removed the tape from my mouth and ordered me to tell the children that I was not leaving him. And when I refused, he slapped me hard enough to knock my head against the table leg. The kid screamed, and he picked up the bat and struck the wall, cracking the plaster to show that he was serious. He pressed the bat against my throat while explaining that divorce destroys families and that he was saving us from a mistake. I could see in his eyes that this was not about love. It was about control, and that realization terrified me more than the weapon in his hands. After a while, he untied my wrist but left my ankles bound, saying that we would talk like adults while the children watched, which made the situation feel even more twisted. I forced myself to speak calmly and asked him to loosen the ropes on the because they were too tight. He hesitated for a second, and that small hesitation gave me a narrow opening. When he bent down to adjust my daughter's rope, I lifted both legs and kicked him as hard as I could in the side of his head. He fell against the coffee table, and I rolled off the chair and dragged my bound wrist against the sharp edge of broken plaster until the rope started to tear my skin, and it then finally began to fray. He recovered quickly and grabbed my ankle, pulling me backward while shouting that I was ruining everything. I twisted and drove my elbow into his throat, then bit his wrist when he tried to cover my mouth, and although he punched me in the side of the head, I kept moving because stopping meant giving him control again. I freed one hand and crawled to my working at the with fingers that felt slow but determined. He lunged toward me, but I kicked his knee hard enough to make him stumble, and I managed to eye both children. I told them clearly to run to the door and not look back, and their faces showed real fear now, not confusion. The front door was locked, and my hands slipped on the knob while I searched for the keys, and I could hear his footsteps getting closer behind us. I grabbed the keys from the hook, dropped them once, and picked them up again while my son cried that he was coming. He slammed into me from behind and pushed me against the wall, knocking the air out of my lungs, and then pulled my hair to drag me away from the door. I blocked his raised fist with my forearm, drove my knee upward to create space, ignoring the sharp pain in my arm. I twisted free and reached the keys first, then ran outside shouting at the kids to get into the car and lock the doors. He tackled me on the gravel before I could reach the driver's side, and we hit the ground hard while he tried to pry the keys from my hand. I swung my arm and the metal key cut across his cheek, and when he tried to pin my arm, I kicked him repeatedly in the stomach until he loosened his grip. I scrambled up, unlocked the car, pushed the kids inside, and locked the doors behind me. He stood in front of the car for a second, staring at me with an expression that felt empty of empathy, and then he stepped aside with a strange smile that made it clear he was not finished. I started the engine and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could. At the gas station, an employee saw the broken window and our injuries and called the police while I explained what had happened in a voice that did not feel like my own. Officers later found Darian trapped with a broken leg, and he tried to claim that I had attacked him first. However, the ropes in the cabin and the marks on our wrist told a different story, and he was arrested that same night. He is now in prison, and my children and I live in a small apartment far from those mountains. Sometimes I realize how close we came to not making it out of that highway alive. Josh Powell was the main suspect in the 2009 disappearance of his wife, Susan Powell, who vanished from their home in Utah under suspicious circumstances. Their marriage had been deteriorating, and there were reports of controlling behavior and increasing tension before she disappeared in 2012. During a court-ordered supervised visitation with his two sons in Washington state, Powell locked the social worker out of the house, attacked the with a hatchet, and then set the house on fire, taking his and both. If you have a child, understand this clearly. The person who wants to hurt them will not look like a monster at first. It will begin with a smile, with polite words, and with a man who seems calm enough to trust. My name is Ellie, and this happened 8 years ago when my daughter Abril was 6 and still small enough to hold my hand in crowded places. When the traveling amusement park arrived in town, I took her there on a Saturday night because she had been talking about it for weeks. That was when he stepped beside me and started talking to me as if we had known each other before. He said my daughter looked fearless and confident. He did not try to impress me with exaggerated stories. He asked simple questions about Abril's age and school, and he listened carefully to my answers. Nothing about him felt aggressive. I saw him again 3 days later near a bakery close to my apartment, and he greeted me by name. I do not remember telling him my name at the fair, but he said it confidently. He asked about Abril and mentioned details about the ride she had chosen, which meant he had been watching her closely. At first, we began crossing paths too often for it to be coincidence. He appeared near the bus stop when I took Abril to school, and he stood outside of my job, always with an explanation that sounded reasonable. Then the questions about Abril became more specific, and that was when my discomfort began to grow. He asked whether Abril slept with toys, whether she was afraid of strangers, and whether she trusted easily. He said these things with a smile, but there was a focus in his eyes that made me feel exposed. I told him clearly that I was not interested in friendship and that I did not want him approaching us anymore. He nodded and said he understood, and his voice stayed calm, but his expression hardened for a second before returning to that polite mask. For a few days after that, he disappeared, and I allowed myself to think that he had accepted my rejection and moved on. 5 nights later, someone knocked on my door at 10 in the evening. When I checked through the peephole, the corridor was empty. When I opened the door carefully, a cardboard box was placed directly in front of it. I hesitated before bringing it inside because a tight feeling had started to build in my chest. But Abril walked into the living room while I was cutting the tape, and I did not have time to stop her from seeing what was inside. The box contained a life-sized doll with a face that looked too realistic to be comforting. Its skin was stretched tightly over sharp features. When I lifted it, I realized it was heavier than it should have been, and the weight did not feel like stuffing or plastic. Abril stepped closer and touched its arm, and she smiled. She hugged it immediately and asked if it was for her, and I did not know how to explain what I was feeling without frightening her. I told her it must have been left by mistake from the fair, even though I understood that he was the only person who would send something like that. She insisted on keeping it and carried it to her room as if it were a treasure. 3 days after the doll arrived, I entered Abril's room to wake her, and I picked up the doll to move it, and my fingers pressed into the arm in a way that made me recoil. The surface was firm but slightly flexible, and the material looked dry and tight. The smell had grown stronger, and it was no longer faint enough to ignore. I carried the doll into the kitchen and placed it on the table under the bright light. I took a knife and pressed the tip gently against a seam near the shoulder. The blade met resistance and then slid into something dense, not stuffing but layered material that did not belong inside a toy. I pulled the knife away quickly and felt a wave of dread that made my breathing uneven. Abril walked into the kitchen at that moment and saw me holding the knife near the doll. Her face shifted from confusion to fear, and she ran forward to grab it, telling me not to hurt her in a voice that cracked with emotion. That night after she fell asleep, I took the doll from her arms and wrapped it in heavy garbage bags. I walked several blocks to a public dumpster and forced myself to throw it inside, because I knew it did not belong anywhere near my child. 4 days later, a padded envelope was left at my door while Abril was at school, and I stood still for a long moment before picking it up. The handwriting on the label matched the writing of the box. Inside, there was a letter that contained one sentence, stating that I should not have thrown her away. My throat tightened as I opened the container over the kitchen sink. A small human hand fell onto the metal surface, gray and stiff, with fingers curled slightly inward. The cut at the wrist was clean, and the nails were dry at the edges. I stared at it in disbelief before my body reacted. I called the police and tried to explain what I was seeing. They examined the hand carefully and confirmed that it was real, and their expressions changed in a way that told me this was far worse than harassment. The next morning, another package arrived, and this time, I did not open it alone. Inside was the same doll, cleaned and dressed in different clothes, with rough stitches around the neck. Another note rested against its chest, stating that I now had to take better care of her. A couple of days later, the forensic report confirmed that the doll was the preserved body of a young girl, carefully treated and arranged to resemble a toy. Police patrols increased around my building, and Abril stayed with my sister while the investigation moved forward. I replayed every conversation with him, recognizing how carefully he had studied us. Weeks later, he was arrested in an apartment across town, where investigators found multiple preserved bodies of young girls arranged around a table. They discovered chemicals, tools, and notebooks containing detailed notes about children he had observed in public places. Abril's name appeared more than once in those pages. During the trial, I saw him again and noticed that his expression remained calm while the charges were read. He did not look ashamed or frightened, and he did not try to deny what had been found in his apartment. When the sentence was announced, he turned his head slightly toward me. He said that she would have been perfect, and he said it with a quiet certainty rather than anger. Those words have stayed with me longer than any photograph shown in court, because they revealed how he viewed my daughter as something to possess. Abril is 14 now. She remembers the doll only as something strange that I took away from her. I am telling this because predators do not always look violent at first, and sometimes they build trust patiently while planning something that you cannot imagine. I was close to losing my daughter to a man who spoke softly and smiled often, and that is a truth I will never forget. Anatoly Moskvin was arrested in 2011 after authorities discovered he had exhumed dozens of young girls' bodies from cemeteries over several years. He brought the remains to his apartment, where he preserved and dressed them like large dolls, arranging them carefully inside his home. Moskvin claimed he felt connected to the children and treated them as if they were still alive, a detail that shocked investigators and the public alike. If someone had recorded what happened in that private room, no one would believe I walked back into it again 2 days later. I had been working the spa for less than a month, still learning and trying to look confident in front of clients. I needed the job, so I ignored the uneasy feeling that followed me down the hallway the day I was assigned to the owner's son. The receptionist avoided eye contact when she handed me the key card for the private room, which already made me feel exposed before I even stepped inside. I had seen him once in the lobby, speaking over everyone and laughing too loudly, and I knew exactly who he was because the staff changed their tone around him. I told myself that he was just another spoiled client and that my job was simple. Just follow the routine and leave. He was lying face down on the table when I entered, shirt off. I felt very disgusted when I got closer. His skin was extremely oily, in a way that is difficult to explain without making me feel sick. The smell in the room was heavy and sour, but I had to focus on keeping my expression neutral so I would not offend him. When I placed my hands on his back, my palms slid too easily, leaving a cloudy film that stuck under my nails. His skin was full of enlarged pores, some dark and clogged, and when I pressed down with more pressure, thin streaks of oil surfaced again as if his body was producing it nonstop. He started making low, exaggerated sounds of pleasure every time I moved my hands, and the noises were not subtle or embarrassed. They were deliberate and loud enough to fill the entire room. Harder. Do not stop there. Press lower. I kept working because I did not want to create a problem. But the longer it went on, the more obvious it became that he was enjoying my discomfort as much as the massage. As the session continued, he began moving his hips slowly against the table, making it impossible to ignore what he was turning the situation into. I tried to redirect the massage toward his shoulders and neck, but he corrected me immediately and ordered me back to his lower back in a tone that did not sound like a suggestion. I stepped away once to wash my hands because they were coated again in grease, and while I stood at the sink, I heard him laughing softly behind me. You do not like getting dirty. You will get used to it. I realized he was testing how far he could push without consequences. When I returned to the table and finally told him the session was over, he rolled onto his back and stared at me in a way that made my skin crawl. His chest and stomach were just as greasy, and the pores were even more visible up close, which made it hard to keep my voice steady. He sat up slowly and said that now it was his turn to give me a massage, as if that were a normal extension of the service. I explained that it was not allowed and that I needed to prepare the room. But he did not accept that answer. I am not asking you. Lock the door properly. When he reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife, small but sharp, the situation shifted from uncomfortable to dangerous in a way that left no room for negotiation. He told me to lock the door, and I did it because I knew no one outside would hear anything over the music. He pressed the blade against my side and ordered me onto the table, reminding me that I worked for his family and that causing trouble would only hurt me. I tried to reason with him, but the knife moved to the back of my neck, and I understood that arguing would only make him more aggressive. I lay face down feeling exposed and powerless, and when he told me to remove my top, I obeyed because I was thinking only about surviving that moment. There was a pause that stretched too long, and then I felt something warm hit my back. He had spit on me, and he spread it slowly with his hands as if it were part of a routine he had practiced before. Do not move. I like when you are quiet. His breathing grew heavy as he leaned closer, and when he shifted toward my face, I knew he was about to spit again, this time directly at me. That thought broke whatever restraint I had left, and I reached blindly for the lamp on the small table beside me. He was so focused on looming over me that he did not notice my arm moving, mixing with the grease and dripping onto the sheets. He screamed in shock and pain, dropping the knife as he stumbled backward, slipping slightly on the oily floor. I rolled off the table, grabbed my shirt without fully putting it on, and rushed to unlock the door while he shouted loudly. She attacked me! Call the police! His voice carried down the hallway, and I knew that whatever happened next would not be simple. I almost collided with his father in the hallway, and I tried to explain everything at once, including the knife and the forced contact, but my words came out fast and uneven. Before the owner responded, his son stepped out behind me, holding his bleeding forehead and pointing at me like I had assaulted him without reason. She is unstable. She hit me for no reason. The owner's expression changed quickly, and instead of checking on me, he focused entirely on his son, ordering towels and telling staff to step back. He then grabbed my arm and pulled me into his office, closing the door with controlled anger. Inside, he spoke in a low voice that was more threatening than shouting, asking if I understood how serious my actions were and how easily this could ruin my career. I repeated what had happened, including the knife and the spit, but he did not react with surprise, which told me that this was not new information for him. He opened a drawer and placed an envelope full of money on the desk, explaining that if the police were called, the security cameras would show only me hitting his son. My son has needs. You should have handled this better. He then made the arrangement clear, saying that I would continue working and that I would attend his son twice a week in the private room with no complaints and no drama. If I refused, I would be fired and they would make sure no other spa hired me. I looked at the envelope and thought about rent and bills, and I understood that I was trapped in a system designed to protect them, not me. 2 days later, I stood again in front of that same door, fully aware that this time he did not even need a knife because the threat was already established. I opened the door and saw him waiting, a fresh bandage on his forehead and the same greasy shine covering his body. He smiled in a way that showed satisfaction rather than anger. Be careful with lamps this time. We both know how this works now. I performed the massage in silence, keeping my movements controlled and mechanical, while he continued to comment on my reactions as if it amused him. He did not threaten me openly again, because he did not need to, and that made the situation feel more permanent and more suffocating. When the session ended, he leaned close and reminded me that he would see me again in a few days, and I left the room knowing that I had not escaped anything. Twice a week, I entered that room knowing exactly what would happen, and I focused on counting minutes and avoiding anything that would trigger another escalation. He acted confident and relaxed as if the arrangement proved his control, and I followed the routine because I believed that losing my job would leave me with nothing. Each session reinforced the imbalance, and the spa continued operating normally, welcoming clients with smiles and soft music while hiding what happened behind one closed door. I understood that the owner would always choose his son over any employee, and that any complaint would turn into a story where I was the unstable one. I am still working there while I search for another job, sending applications and hoping someone calls before I lose the ability to endure this routine. I now understand why so many women disappeared from the staff list without explanation. Until I find a way out, I keep showing up sliding the key card, hearing the lock click, and stepping into that room where everything is clean on the surface and rotten underneath. If I had not stayed in my seat and finished my fries, I would not be telling this story right now. I was 14 years old on that Halloween night sitting inside a McDonald's that my friends treated like a legend. That specific location had a rumor attached to it, and even though adults rolled their eyes, kids at school swore the burgers tasted wrong. The story was simple and disgusting at the same time. People said the meat was mixed with human flesh. Nobody had proof, but everyone had a cousin or a neighbor who knew someone who had noticed something strange. It became a dare between us, a creepy challenge to see who could eat there without flinching. My parents thought it was nonsense. They were focused on finding a table while my little sister complained about her costume. The restaurant was full of families, fake cobwebs, and plastic pumpkins taped to the walls. It looked harmless, loud, and normal. I kept staring at the hallway that led to the kitchen, and the more I looked at it, the more I felt pulled toward it. I wanted to see the grill with my own eyes and prove that the rumor was just a stupid story. When my parents started arguing about where to sit, I slid out of the booth and walked toward the employees-only door. I moved slowly so no one would notice, telling myself I would just peek and come back in less than a minute. My heart was beating fast, but I convinced myself it was just excitement. An employee pushed through the door carrying a tray, and before it shut completely, I slipped inside. The kitchen was bright and loud, filled with the sound of oil popping and orders being called out. Everything looked exactly like a normal fast food kitchen. For a few seconds, I almost felt embarrassed for believing the rumor. Workers were flipping patties, salting fries, and stacking buns in quick, practiced motions. There were no secret rooms and no obvious signs of anything illegal. Still, I stepped further in and stood behind a stack of boxes so I could observe without being seen. I wanted to be sure before I walked back out. At first, nothing seemed strange, and I started thinking I should leave before I got caught. Then my eyes landed on a metal prep table near the back wall, and I leaned slightly to get a clearer look. The lights were bright, and there was no confusion about what was in front of me. There was a human hand resting on the table. It was clean and pale, cut at the wrist, placed next to a tray like it belonged there. My brain tried to tell me it was fake, but it did not look like a cheap Halloween prop. It looked real. When I stepped back, I knocked over a trash can, and the crash echoed through the kitchen. Several employees turned their heads at the same time. One of them walked straight toward me without rushing, which made it worse because he looked calm. "What are you doing here?" I tried to answer, but I kept staring at the table. He followed my gaze and then looked back at me with a different expression. Another employee came up behind me and pressed his hand over my mouth, while the first one grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "You were not supposed to see that." They dragged me across the floor while I struggled, and I could feel my shoes sliding on the tile as I tried to pull free. Nobody from the dining area came in, and the noise of the machines covered everything. They moved me to a metal prep table in the corner and forced me on top of it while one of them cleared space. I fought back as much as I could, but they worked together and held me down with steady pressure. One tied my wrists with rough cord, while another secured my ankles to the table legs. I tried to shout when they removed the hand from my mouth, but one of them leaned close and spoke over me. "You wanted to know what's in the meat, right?" The way he said it was not playful. It sounded controlled and deliberate. The other two watched my face closely, like they were waiting for my reaction. One of them lifted my arm and examined it slowly, running his fingers along my skin. Another grabbed a container of salt and sprinkled it across my forearm, spreading it with his palm while smiling in a way that made my chest tighten. Fresh. They talked about me like I was an item on the menu. I kept pulling against the ropes, but they held tight and cut into my skin. I looked toward the door, hoping someone would walk in, but the kitchen kept running like nothing was wrong. One of them stepped away and grabbed a large kitchen knife from near the grill. He held it up so I could see the full blade, and the overhead lights reflected off the metal. The other two leaned closer to the table while the fryer continued bubbling behind me. He pressed the flat side of the knife against my arm first, and the cold metal made me tense. When he turned the blade so the sharp edge touched my skin, I felt a thin line of pressure that made it hard to breathe steadily. I pulled hard against the ropes, but they held me in place. "You were curious, so now you get a closer look." Another employee leaned near my face. "We will name the combo after you." The blade started moving slowly across my arm in a cutting motion, and I braced for pain. My body strained against the restraints, and I could feel my shoulders arching from the effort. Just as the pressure increased, he stopped the blade before it broke the skin. All three of them began laughing, and the sound felt loud and wrong in that small space. The one holding the knife stepped back. "Happy Halloween!" They picked up the hand from the table and bent the fingers to show it was rubber. They opened a drawer filled with fake body parts and explained that they were tired of rumors and had decided to scare anyone who tried to sneak into the kitchen. They untied me and warned me not to tell anyone, saying that the next time it would not be so harmless. I walked back to my family's table and sat down without saying a word. I told my parents I felt sick and we left early. For weeks after that, I avoided the place and tried to convince myself it had only been a twisted prank. I stopped eating burgers and ignored my friends when they joked about the rumor. Part of me wanted to believe it was all fake. One evening, my dad called me into the living room and pointed at the television. The news showed that Sam McDonald's surrounded by police cars and yellow tape. The reporter explained that the restaurant had been shut down after investigators discovered human remains stored inside the kitchen. 3 employees had been arrested. When their faces appeared on the screen, I recognized them immediately. The report said small amounts of human tissue had been mixed with regular meat for months. The so-called Halloween props had included real body parts that were altered and stored. I sat there staring at the screen, realizing that the knife against my arm had not been part of a harmless joke. They had laughed while holding a real blade and real body parts in that kitchen. The only reason I was not part of that investigation was because they decided to let me walk out. My parents never learned what really happened behind that door. They still think I just wandered somewhere I should not have been and got scared by decorations. I never corrected them because I do not know how to explain how close I came to becoming something else. The building is now empty and the sign is gone, but I still remember the metal table and the way they spoke about me like I was food. I went in to prove a rumor was fake, and instead, I learned that sometimes the worst stories are not exaggerations at all. When your best friend shows up at your door in the middle of the night and says he needs to leave the city right now, you understand that whatever is happening is already bigger than a simple trip. This happened a few years ago. I knew Ray most of my life. We grew up together, shared plans, trusted each other without question. Months before the trip, he started acting different in a way that was hard to ignore. He avoided crowds, installed extra locks, and kept checking behind him like someone might be following. I tried to help him seek psychological assistance, as his episodes of paranoia only worsened over time. After not speaking with Ray for a while, when we saw each other again, he seemed to have left his problems behind. But one night he showed up at my apartment looking exhausted and desperate. He said he needed to leave the city immediately because staying there was destroying his mind. He told me he could not explain everything yet, but he needed me with him because I was the only person he trusted completely. I thought he was overwhelmed and needed a break, so I agreed to travel with him to a quiet coastal city. I believed a short vacation might calm him down. Honestly, with everything Ray had been through in recent years, it didn't seem like a bad idea to grant his request and take a break. After all, that's what friends are for. I did not understand that he was not planning to rest. We went to a small town far away from the city, which I won't name for safety reasons. I'll just say that it was very peaceful and surrounded by nature. The hotel was small and calm, the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happens. I expected Ray to relax once we arrived, but instead he became more tense. He kept the curtains closed, refused housekeeping, and moved furniture near the door at night. That really surprised me. I thought I was doing the right thing by coming here with him. On the second evening, he finally explained what he believed was happening. He said he had joined a private group months earlier, something presented as a professional circle that later revealed strict rules and secret meetings. A lodging house. According to him, once you gave your word to them, walking away was not allowed. I told him that stress and isolation can distort perception, and I suggested we return home and look for professional help, this time for real. He reacted sharply and insisted this was not anxiety, but a real threat. He said people connected to the group had been watching him for months. He admitted that the trip was not a vacation, but an attempt to disappear for a while, hide from the lodge. He asked me to trust him and stay until things settled. I agreed, although I was convinced he needed medical help, not distance. The day he vanished felt forced from the start, like we were pretending everything was fine. We had coffee at a bar near the harbor, and although the place was quiet, he kept scanning the room. I tried to keep the conversation normal, but he barely responded and kept checking his phone. That afternoon, he insisted on walking alone because he felt trapped inside the hotel. I offered to join him, but he refused and promised to return before dinner. I watched him leave and told myself giving him space might help. But 9 that night, he had not returned, and his phone went straight to voicemail. I searched the nearby streets, checked the bar again, and asked strangers if they had seen him. Nobody had. When I got back to the hotel, our door was slightly open. I stopped several steps away and listened, trying to decide whether Ray had returned or whether someone else was inside. The hallway was empty and silent. I pushed the door open and stepped in. 3 men stood in the middle of the room wearing long dark robes and smooth masks that covered their faces completely. They did not move quickly or speak loudly, and their calm posture made it clear they were not surprised to see me. One of them closed the door behind me while others stayed still. They said they were looking for Ray and that he had obligations he failed to complete. Their tone was controlled, but there was no room for negotiation. I told them they were mistaken, but one of them grabbed my arm firmly and another pulled out a cloth with a sharp chemical smell. I understood immediately that they were not there to talk. They forced me toward the wall and pressed the cloth against my face while I struggled to pull away. I held my breath and tried to twist free, but they coordinated their movements. My shoulder hit the wall hard and pain shot down my arm. While fighting to stay conscious, I reached toward the nightstand and felt the emergency button we had noticed earlier. I slammed it repeatedly until a loud alarm filled the room. The sudden noise disrupted them long enough for me to break free. I ran toward the balcony, climbed over the railing, and dropped to the balcony below. The fall hurt badly and left me disoriented, but I forced myself up and ran down the emergency stairs. I did not stop until I reached the street and blended into a small group of people. I stayed awake all night in a diner, trying to process what had happened. By morning, I returned to the hotel and saw police cars outside. A crowd had gathered near the back entrance. On the pavement below the upper floors, I saw a covered body. Even before anyone confirmed it, I knew it was Ray. The police told me he had fallen from a high level during the night. They said there were no signs of forced entry and that security footage showed no one entering or leaving our floor except me. According to the records, Ray had never left the building after we returned from coffee. That detail did not match what I experienced, but I had no proof. The room showed no signs of struggle. There was no alarm record, no visible damage, nothing that supported my story. They found a strange note on his laptop filled with references and coded phrases. The case was labeled undetermined, but the tone of the investigation suggested they believed he jumped after an episode of paranoia. I stood there knowing something had happened inside that building that would never be officially acknowledged. After returning home, I tried to resume normal life, but the memory of those masked men stayed clear in my mind. I avoided discussing the trip in detail and focused on routine. Even simple noises in my apartment started to feel significant. One evening, I came home and found an envelope on my kitchen table. There was no stamp and no return address, which meant someone had entered or had access to my space. I opened it carefully and found a photo of my parents' house taken from across the street. Under the photo was a short typed message that said, "We'll come for you." I reported the letter to the police, but they treated it as a possible prank. I warned my parents without giving them full details because I did not want to alarm them unnecessarily. Deep down, I understood that whatever Ray had feared was not over. After that letter, I stopped pretending I could live a normal life. I left my apartment within a week and did not tell anyone where I was going, not even my parents. Since then, I have moved from city to city, renting small places under short contracts, paying in cash when I can, and never staying long enough to feel settled. I avoid routines, change gyms, switch grocery stores, and never walk the same route twice, because the idea of being predictable feels like handing them a map to find me. I travel light now, with one suitcase that stays half-packed at all times, ready for the next move if something feels wrong. When I sit in cafes, I choose seats facing the entrance, and when someone holds eye contact for too long, I leave without finishing my drink. I do not know if they are actually watching or if fear has reshaped my habits permanently, but the difference no longer matters because my life is built around the possibility that they are patient and organized. Years have passed and Ray's case remains unresolved, discussed online as a mystery with no clear answers, but for me, it never ended. I stopped expecting closure a long time ago, and I already know that the truth doesn't need to be public to be real. That's how it ends for me, with no answers, no justice, just running away. Ray Riviera died in 2006 after falling from the historic Belvedere Hotel in Baltimore under circumstances that remain deeply unsettling. He disappeared after receiving a sudden phone call, and days later, his body was found in a conference room below a hole in the roof. What intensified the mystery was a strange cryptic note taped behind the computer, filled with references to secret societies, Freemasonry, and coded language that investigators struggled to interpret. The causes of his death remain mysterious.
The video that ruined our lives started as a cheap attempt to ride a trend that was already everywhere on TikTok. My boyfriend Gustav and I ran a channel where we explored strange places, tested viral apps, and chased trends. When the Randonautica trend came back, Gustav insisted we should try it because the numbers on those videos were huge again. The app generates random coordinates and claims you might find something meaningful or disturbing if you follow them. We both thought it was nonsense, but nonsense that could easily turn into millions of views if something unusual happened on camera. The location it gave us was a quiet stretch of beach about an hour from the city, far from tourist areas and mostly empty, even during daylight. That kind of isolation worked well for filming because there were no interruptions, no curious strangers, and no background noise except the ocean and the wind. At that moment, we were excited in a normal way, the same energy we had before any new upload. If someone had told me that this trip would end with police tape, I would have laughed because nothing about that gray afternoon looked important or dangerous. We began recording as soon as we stepped onto the sand because viewers like to see the entire journey toward the coordinates. Gustav spoke to the camera while I followed the GPS marker, adjusting our direction whenever the arrow shifted. The beach looked empty enough that our voices carried easily over the sound of the waves. After several minutes of walking, I noticed something dark ahead, near the waterline that did not match the natural shapes around it. At first I assumed it was debris from a boat or a large container washed ashore, but the outline looked too straight and deliberate to be random trash. As we approached, both of us slowed down because the object was clearly a large suitcase lying on its side in the wet sand. One corner was partly buried, and the tide kept reaching it before sliding back again, leaving a dark outline around the shell. The sight felt wrong in a way that neither of us could explain, but the camera was still recording, so we kept moving closer. Gustav suggested that someone might have lost it, or that it had fallen from a ship. Yet his voice sounded strained as he spoke, because the suitcase looked heavy and intentionally placed rather than accidentally abandoned. We exchanged a brief look that said we were both thinking the same thing, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud. We stood next to the suitcase for several seconds, while the wind pushed sand against our shoes and the water crept forward again. Neither of us touched it immediately because the situation had shifted from exciting to deeply uncomfortable, and the silence between us felt thicker than the air. I finally nudged the suitcase with my foot to see if it would move easily, but it barely shifted despite the wet sand beneath it. That small resistance made my chest tighten because luggage filled with clothes should not feel that solid. Gustav lowered the camera slightly, focusing on the latches while asking if we should open it. The decision felt heavier than it should have, as if we were about to cross a line we could not step back from. I crouched down and pulled at the bent latch while Gustav leaned closer to film. The metal snapped free with a dry sound that seemed too loud for such an empty place. When I lifted the lid slightly, something inside shifted with a dull, heavy movement that did not resemble normal objects. Gustav moved closer, trying to capture the interior on camera, and the moment the opening widened, a thick, rotten smell rushed out so strongly that he recoiled while covering his mouth. Inside were several black garbage bags packed tightly together, and one of them had split enough to reveal pale human skin pressed against the plastic. It took a second for my brain to accept what I was seeing, but once it did, I slammed the suitcase shut with both hands while Gustav stumbled backward, making a sharp sound that did not sound like anything I had heard from him before. For a few seconds, we just stared at the closed suitcase while the camera lay forgotten in the sand, recording our reaction. The reality of what we had found settled in slowly, bringing a cold sense of danger that had nothing to do with the ocean or the empty beach. Gustav said we needed to call the police immediately, and his voice trembled despite his effort to stay composed. I dialed emergency services while keeping my eyes fixed on the suitcase because the idea of turning away from it made me feel exposed. While I was on the phone, A wave surged farther than the others and struck the suitcase directly, pushing it slightly to one side. Gustav grabbed my arm and pulled me backward, clearly afraid that the lid might open again and expose what we had already seen. The minutes before the police arrived felt painfully slow, filled only with the steady rhythm of the sea and the distant cries of birds. When the flashing lights finally appeared, relief hit so hard that my legs felt weak, even though I had not moved much at all. Officers secured the area quickly and moved us away while asking how we discovered the suitcase. One of them opened it carefully while another blocked our view, but the expressions on their faces confirmed everything we already knew. The video began spreading online almost immediately because the recording had partially uploaded before we stopped filming. Within hours, millions of people had watched the moment we opened the suitcase, and news outlets started contacting us for interviews. 2 days later, Gustav returned to his apartment alone to collect some personal items while I stayed behind to handle calls from reporters. The building hallway looked normal when he arrived, quiet and unchanged, which made what happened next even more shocking. As soon as he stepped inside and closed the door, a man rushed from behind the entrance corner and grabbed his shoulder violently. He forced him against the wall and pressed a knife near his ribs, breathing hard as if he had been waiting there for a long time. "How did you find it? Who sent you there?" Gustav tried to speak steadily, even though the situation was terrifying, explaining that we used a random coordinate app and had no idea what we would discover. The man stared at him with intense suspicion and shook his head, clearly convinced he was lying. "Someone told you. You ruined everything." He repeated the truth, describing the trend, the filming, and the fact that millions of people use the same app without any control over where it sends them. Noise from neighboring apartments began spilling into the hallway because the struggle had not gone unnoticed. The man's focus shifted toward the door as voices grew louder outside, and his grip tightened as panic replaced his earlier control. Gustav continued speaking calmly, hoping to keep him from reacting violently while the sounds outside increased. Sirens approached in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. When the police arrived, the man shoved him to the floor and tried to escape through the hallway, but officers intercepted him almost immediately. Gustav remained inside, shaken but alive, while the chaos moved outside his apartment. Investigators later identified him as Michael Lee, the landlord of the 2 victims found in the suitcase. He had murdered Jessica and Austin after a dispute over unpaid rent and disposed of their bodies at the beach, believing no one would ever discover them. Michael Lee eventually confessed once the evidence against him became overwhelming, and the case drew massive public attention because of the viral video that documented the discovery. For viewers, it was shocking content, but for us, it became a permanent shadow that followed everything we did afterward. I began receiving letters from him in prison, filled with anger and accusations that we had intentionally exposed him. Each letter repeated the same demand for an answer, insisting that someone must have guided us to that exact location. Michael Lee is still in prison, still sending letters, and still asking the same question. "Who sent you to the suitcase?" Michael Lee murdered his tenants, Jessica and Austin, after they fell behind on a rent payment, then hid their dismembered remains inside a suitcase and abandoned it. 3 teenagers later discovered the luggage and posted the find online without realizing it contained human remains. The video quickly went viral, reaching around 30 million views, which drew massive public attention and ultimately led investigators to the case.
For 2 years, I worked as an Uber driver in a mid-sized city in the United States. I started the job after losing my office position during a round of layoffs. Driving people around was not glamorous, but it paid my rent and gave me control over my hours. I also had one rule. I only accepted rides from women. I canceled every other request. Some passengers complained about it online, but I did not care. Late nights and strangers in the back seat can go wrong very quickly. I decided early that I would not take that risk. Most nights were simple. Pick someone up from a bar, drive them home, listen to short conversations about work or relationships, then move on to the next ride. The app kept everything organized: name, location, rating. I followed the map and avoided trouble. The ride that destroyed my life started like any other. A request appeared on my phone from a passenger named Elsa. The rating was good. Pickup location was a quiet apartment street not far from downtown. I accepted the ride without thinking much about it. The street was calm when I arrived. I parked near the curb and waited. A woman stood near the building entrance. She checked her phone, then looked at my car. Before she could move, a man walked up behind her. He leaned down and he kissed her quickly. She did not look pleased. Her shoulders were tense and she kept glancing at the car. The man opened the back door and climbed inside instead of her. The woman stayed on the sidewalk. She crossed her arms and watched him sit down. Sorry about this. My phone died earlier. She ordered the ride for me. Hope that's okay. That kind of situation happened sometimes.
I preferred female passengers, but the ride had already started, and he seemed friendly enough. Just add a note in the app next time, that's all.
He nodded and thanked me. His voice was calm. Nothing about him stood out. I started driving toward the destination on the map. A few minutes into the ride, the man leaned forward slightly. Actually, I need to change the trip. I forgot something at my place. Can we stop there first? That happened all the time. Passengers adjusted destinations during rides. I told him to update it in the app. He picked up his phone and tapped the screen. A moment later, the map changed. While the navigation recalculated, I noticed something that did not make sense. He had told me his phone battery was dead, yet he was using it now without any problem. I kept driving, but the thought stayed in my head. The first destination was only 5 minutes away. Before we reached it, the road became quiet. No traffic, no pedestrians, just apartment buildings and closed storefronts. I slowed the car and stopped at the address the app showed. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The man in the back seat looked out the window like he was waiting for someone. The passenger door suddenly opened. Another man stepped into the car and sat beside him. The first man no longer looked friendly. His face went blank. He stopped smiling and leaned back into the seat. I tried to keep my voice steady.
I thought you were picking something up.
No answer.
That was the stop, right?
The new passenger closed the door slowly. Drive to the second destination. His voice was quiet and flat. The map updated again. I looked at it for a second. The route was heading toward the edge of the city. I drove for 10 minutes before speaking again.
This area isn't a normal drop-off zone. I don't feel comfortable going out there. I'm ending the trip.
The car rolled to a slow stop on the road. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of them grabbed my hair from behind and pulled my head backward. My neck bent against the seat. I could not see clearly. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Cold metal pressed against my throat. It was a knife. The second man leaned close to my ear. Keep driving. His voice did not rise. He spoke like someone giving a simple instruction. Quiet, straight ahead. My heart started pounding so hard that my vision blurred for a moment. The man holding my hair did not pull harder. He just kept my head tilted back enough to remind me he could. No one else spoke. I started driving again. The next 20 minutes were silent. Both men sat behind me, watching every movement. I could see them in the mirror. They never looked away. No conversation, no instructions, just steady staring. I gripped the wheel and followed the map while the city lights disappeared behind us. Soon, the road turned narrow. Empty land surrounded us. No houses nearby. I started crying before we even reached the location.
Please, I won't report anything. Just let me go.
Neither man reacted. The map announced the destination. I stopped the car. For 1 second, I considered stepping on the gas and turning the vehicle around. Instead, I opened the door and ran. That was another mistake. My legs barely carried me 3 steps. Someone tackled me from the side. The third man knocked the air out of my chest when he slammed into me. We both crashed into the dirt beside the road, and I lost control of my breath. Before I could even roll away, The other two were already on top of me. One of them grabbed my jacket and dragged me a short distance, while the others began kicking my ribs and my legs. The blows came fast and methodical. They were not yelling or threatening me. They were simply doing it. I tried to crawl away, but someone grabbed my ankle and pulled me back. Another kick landed in my side and forced the air out of my lungs again. I rolled onto my back and raised my arms to block my face. One of them shoved a cloth into my mouth and tied it tight behind my head. I could barely breathe through it. My wrists were pulled behind me and tied together with rope that burned my skin when I struggled. They lifted me by my arms and shoulders and carried me back to the car. I could hear the gravel crunching under their shoes while my feet dragged behind. The back door opened and they threw me against the seat like a bag. My head hit the opposite door and everything went dark for a moment. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was one of them sliding into the driver's seat. When I woke up again, I was sitting on a cold floor in a basement. My wrists were tied to a metal pipe behind me and my ankles were bound as well. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling and it barely lit the room. On a small table nearby, there was a plastic bottle of water, a piece of stale bread, and a cheap calendar. That calendar became the only thing that allowed me to understand how much time was passing. Life in that basement followed a pattern that never really changed. One of the men came downstairs once or twice a day. Sometimes he brought food, sometimes he did not. Sometimes he untied me and forced me to stand before pushing me against the wall and hitting me until I collapsed again. They rarely spoke while doing it. The silence made everything worse because I never knew when the next visit would happen. The calendar slowly filled with marks that I scratched into it with a loose piece of metal I found near the wall. At first, I counted every day. Later, I only counted weeks. My body became weaker each month. Walking a few steps across the room made my legs shake. My ribs healed badly after repeated injuries, and breathing deeply started to hurt all the time. Almost 3 years passed before anything changed. One morning, I woke up on the floor and could barely lift my head. My body was exhausted, and my vision kept fading in and out. While I lay there, I heard several voices upstairs and loud footsteps moving through the house. The basement door burst open a few minutes later, and police officers rushed down the stairs with flashlights pointed directly at me. Hands quickly cut the rope from my wrists, and someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, while others searched the room. I could hear radios and urgent voices filling the space that had been silent for years. Later, they told me the house had been discovered during an investigation connected to one of the men. The 3 of them were arrested that same day, and the officers who found me said I was only hours away from dying. The rescue did not end the damage those years caused. I spent months in hospitals recovering from injuries, infections, and severe malnutrition. Doctors had to repair broken bones and treat scars that never healed correctly. Walking without help took a long time to relearn because my body had become too weak to support itself. When I finally left the hospital, life outside felt unfamiliar. Loud noises made my body react instantly, and I could not stay in crowded places for long. The idea of driving again became impossible. Every time I sat in the driver's seat of a car, my hands started shaking and my chest tightened until I had to step outside and breathe. Eventually, the doctors recommended long-term psychiatric treatment. They said the trauma had gone too deep to handle alone. That is where I am now. The facility is quiet and controlled, and the staff asks me to describe what happened whenever my memories become overwhelming. So I tell the story again from the beginning. The ride request from a woman named Elsa. The boyfriend who entered the car instead. The second passenger waiting at the first stop. The road that led out of the city, and the moment when everything changed. Every time I finish telling it, the room becomes quiet for a few seconds. The doctors usually ask the same questions after listening to the entire story. Why those men chose me? After everything that happened in that basement, I still do not know the answer.
I used to run a small YouTube channel where I visited places that people say are cursed. It pays for trips and cheap hotels, nothing big. just enough to keep moving. 3 weeks ago, I was in Japan with my friends Ryan, Cole, and Marcus. We were on vacation, but we always looked for something we could turn into content. Someone suggested the legend of Hanako-san, a spirit that waits in school bathrooms. You knock 3 times and call her name. We found an abandoned elementary school outside the city. Windows cracked, lockers rusted, dust everywhere. Perfect for a thumbnail. We set up cameras and joked about how fake it all sounded. The plan was simple. Go into the girls' bathroom, knock on the 3rd stall, call her name, and wait. If nothing happened, we would edit it with dramatic music and act disappointed. The hallway leading to the bathroom was narrow. Our footsteps echoed too much. Ryan kept checking the audio levels. Cole held a flashlight under his chin, acting stupid for the camera. We pushed open the bathroom door. Tiles were broken, mirrors were dirty but still intact. The 3rd stall door hung slightly open. I stood in front of it while the others aimed their cameras at me. I knocked 3 times. Slow, clear.
Hanako-san, are you there?
Nothing answered. We waited. Marcus counted to 10 with his fingers. No movement, no sound. Just silence and our breathing. They laughed, said we got clickbaited by folklore. We filmed a few more takes for safety, then decided to leave. It was getting dark outside. We packed most of the gear. I told them I wanted extra shots of the hallway and the bathroom for atmosphere. They said they would wait in the courtyard. I stayed behind with my camera and tripod. The building was too quiet once they left. Their voices faded down the corridor. I could hear my own steps too clearly. I went back inside the bathroom for one last wide shot. I adjusted the tripod and checked the frame. The 3rd stall was centered. I knocked again, not for the video this time, just once. I don't know why I did it. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The air didn't change, the lights didn't flicker. It was just still. Then the 3rd stall door slammed shut. It wasn't a soft movement. It hit the frame hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. I jumped back and almost dropped the camera. I stood there staring at it. My mouth was dry. I told myself it was loose hinges. Wind. Old buildings do that. I stepped closer to show the door on camera. My hands were shaking, but I tried to keep the shot steady. That's when I saw it. Under the stall door, 2 small feet appeared. Bare. Pale. Standing flat on the tile. They weren't there before. I had filmed that exact angle minutes earlier. There had been nothing. I backed away slowly. My heel slipped on dust, and I hit the sink behind me. The impact hurt my spine. Guys, stop messing around. My voice echoed too loud. No one answered. The feet didn't move. They just stayed there, facing forward. I turned and ran for the exit. The bathroom door slammed shut in front of me before I reached it. The sound was sharp and final. I grabbed the handle and pulled. It didn't budge. Ryan, open the door. I hit it with my shoulder. Pain shot through my arm. The door didn't even shake. Behind me, I heard the stall latch click open. I didn't turn around at first. I kept pulling at the handle, twisting it hard enough to hurt my wrist. There was a slow sound behind me, bare feet touching tile. One step, then another. I forced myself to look. The stall door was open now. A small girl stood inside. Short black hair, red skirt, white shirt stained near the collar. She stepped out into the bathroom. Her face was calm. She didn't blink. She walked toward me at a steady pace. I tried to move sideways. My legs didn't respond. It wasn't fear freezing me. I've been scared before. This was different. My muscles felt locked, like someone was holding every joint in place. She stopped a few feet away, close enough for me to see her eyes clearly.
Why did you call me?
Her voice was soft but flat. No anger, no sadness. I tried to answer. My jaw trembled, but no words came out. She tilted her head slightly.
Don't you want to play anymore?
I could feel tears running down my face. I wasn't trying to cry. It just happened. She smiled.
That's fine. I'll play anyway.
She stepped closer until her face was inches from mine. I could see the small cracks on her lips. Her hand shot up and grabbed my cheeks. Her fingers were cold and strong. Too strong for a child. I tried to pull back, but my body still refused to move. She opened her mouth. Black liquid poured out. It wasn't a small amount. It It came out thick and heavy, covering my nose, my eyes, my mouth. It tasted bitter and metallic. I screamed, but it filled my throat. I coughed and choked. It went into my nose and burned. She didn't stop. She kept holding my face, emptying more into me. I couldn't breathe. My chest spasmed. My vision blurred completely. Everything went dark. I woke up on the bathroom floor with my back against the cold tiles. My throat burned and my chest hurt from coughing. Ryan was shaking my shoulders while Marcus kept repeating my name. Cole had the camera pointed at my face, but his hands were trembling so much that the frame kept drifting. They said they found me in the hallway on my knees, crying and choking. According to them, I suddenly ran back into the bathroom alone and slammed the door. When they forced it open, I was on the ground, clawing at my own face like I was trying to scrape something off. I pushed them away and crawled toward the sink. I could still taste it. Thick, bitter. I leaned over the porcelain and forced myself to vomit. Before anything came out, there was a long second where nothing happened. My body tensed. My stomach tightened hard enough to make me gasp. I felt something rise slowly through my throat, heavy and wrong. What spilled into the sink was black. It clung to the surface and didn't mix with the water when I turned the faucet on. It moved slowly down the drain, leaving streaks behind. No one spoke. Ryan stepped back first. Marcus covered his mouth. Cole lowered the camera without saying anything. They checked every stall again. Empty. Dry. No footprints. No signs of anyone else. The third stall door swung loosely like it had earlier. Normal. Too normal. We left the school without packing properly. We didn't film an outro. Nobody suggested going back inside. Back home, I thought distance would fix it. It didn't. Every night, I woke up facing my bathroom door. I wasn't choosing to. My body just turned that way. I couldn't move when it happened, not even to blink. I didn't see her standing there. I never saw her again. But I knew she was on the other side of that door, waiting for me to knock. My health started failing. I lost weight fast. I couldn't keep food down. Sometimes I would cough and black liquid would come out. Not a lot. Just enough to remind me. Doctors ran tests. They found nothing. They suggested stress. Ryan stopped answering my calls. Marcus deleted the footage from that day. Cole said the camera glitched during the important parts. I'm alone now. Everyone left me. All my days are just the same. I just wait for her to come play with me. If I'm lucky, one of these days, she will get bored and just end me.
I was driving north after midnight, heading to my parents' house with my family asleep in the car, and I kept forcing my eyes open because I had already slept the night before and refused to admit I needed a break. Claire had offered to drive earlier, but I said I was fine and kept the wheel. My son Ethan and my daughter Lily were asleep in the back seat, leaning against each other, and Claire had closed her eyes beside me, scrolling through her phone for a while. The highway was empty in a way that felt wrong, with no headlights and no cars passing. I knew this road well, and I could list every exit in order without thinking, so I expected to see the gas station near exit 14 soon. It never appeared. The white lines kept sliding under the headlights while the road stretched forward without change, and I started gripping the wheel harder than necessary. I checked the clock and calculated the time in my head, and by that point, I should have passed at least 2 familiar landmarks. Instead, the highway continued straight with no exit signs and no buildings on either side. I reached for my phone to open the GPS, but it was not in the cup holder or my pocket, and when I checked the console, I found nothing. I did not wake Claire because I did not want to admit I was confused. 20 more minutes passed with no visible progress, and I shifted my attention to the fuel gauge because I knew I had started with less than half a tank. The needle showed completely full. I stared at it, expecting it to drop or flicker, but it stayed pressed against the maximum mark as if the car had not consumed a single drop. I tested the brake pedal carefully, pressing it with steady pressure while keeping my eyes on the road. The car did not slow down. I pressed harder, then tried lifting my foot from the accelerator, but my leg would not move and felt locked in place. My fingers were clumped around the steering wheel, and no matter how much I tried to loosen them, they would not release. The highway ahead changed abruptly, and deep cracks split across the lanes while dark red stains spread unevenly across the asphalt. The headlights revealed torn fabrics and shapes that looked disturbingly human scattered across the road. I blinked several times, hoping fatigue was distorting my sight, but the details sharpened instead of fading, and the car continued forward at the same speed over the broken pavement without swerving. I realized I had no control over the vehicle or my own body, and that understanding created a focused fear that pushed every other thought aside. Before looking into the rearview mirror, I hesitated because I sensed that whatever was behind me would confirm that this was not exhaustion. My chest felt tight and my pulse pounded loudly in my ears. When I looked, I saw two figures running directly behind the car at full speed, matching the vehicle without effort. Their arms bent sharply at wrong angles, and their mouths were stretched open as they screamed. The sound reached me through the closed windows, sharp and constant, and it drilled into my head without pause. Their eyes were fixed on me through the mirror. I tried to call Claire, forcing my voice out while my body stayed locked, but she did not move. The figures leaned forward as they ran, and their screams grew louder. I felt a hand grip my shoulder from the passenger side, and I turned my head slowly because I knew something was sitting beside me. A woman was there, with her neck twisted completely around and her face crushed out of shape. Yet her eyes were focused and intense. She leaned closer and spoke carefully. "Wake up. You do not belong here." Her grip tightened while the screaming behind the car rose to a piercing level that felt unbearable. For a brief second, all sound vanished, and that silence felt worse than the noise because it signaled something violent was coming. My vision narrowed while my hands remained locked to the wheel. The car jerked sharply to the right, and the headlights tilted toward darkness beyond the shoulder of the road. A violent impact followed as the vehicle dropped down and slammed into something solid. The steering wheel hit my chest, the windshield shattered, and my head snapped forward before slamming sideways. The seatbelt cut into my collarbone while the car twisted and stopped at an angle. I heard Ethan and Lily crying behind me, and the panic cut through the smoke filling the cabin. I turned toward Claire and saw her body slumped against the door with her neck bent at a severe angle, identical to what I had just seen. Men shouted outside while pulling at the doors, and rough hands dragged me out before cutting the seatbelt. They pulled the kids out next while they cried for their mother. As I lay on the ground, I saw them reach Claire and then slow down when they realized she was not moving. Sirens approached while my vision faded. I woke up under hospital lights with my chest wrapped and my arm in a sling, and a doctor explained that I had fallen asleep at the wheel before overcorrecting and sending the car off the road into a concrete barrier. He said my children would recover, but Claire died instantly from a neck fracture. The memory returned clearly, and I remembered her offering to drive because she saw how tired I was. I remember refusing and then closing my eyes for a second too long. I recalled waking up to the car drifting right and jerking the wheel sharply in panic, which caused the tires to lose grip and the vehicle to drop down the embankment. When I looked toward the door of the hospital room, I briefly thought I saw her reflection standing there with her head tilted unnaturally, but it disappeared when I blinked. 8 months have passed, and Ethan still wakes up from nightmares, while Lily refuses to sit in the front seat of any car. They survived with minor injuries, but they ask about their mother often. I returned once to the highway during the day, and everything looked normal with intact pavement and clear exit signs. The gas station near exit 14 was exactly where it should be. I do not tell anyone about the endless road or the figures running behind the car, because the truth is simple and worse than any vision. I fell asleep while driving my family. When exhaustion hits late at night, I sometimes hear distant screaming in my memory, and I force myself to stand up and move instead of closing my eyes. I know what caused the crash, but the images from that drive remain sharp and refuse to leave. The last time I saw my ex before the restraining order, she was standing across the street from my apartment staring at my windows as if she still lived there. The last time I saw her after that, I was trapped inside a tanning bed while she raised the temperature and listened to me scream. 6 months ago, I filed a restraining order against Mara because her obsession stopped being emotional and started feeling strategic. She tracked my schedule, showed up at places I never told her about, and sent messages describing what I wore during the day. She never shouted or begged in public, which made it worse because she acted calm while proving she could reach me anytime. When the court approved the order, she disappeared without protest. No calls, no emails, no sudden appearances. That silence made it easier to believe she had moved on, and after a few months, I stopped checking over my shoulder every time I stepped outside. A new spa opened near my apartment, and I booked a tanning session to deal with stress. I did not check who worked there, and I did not imagine that she would be employed in the control room, monitoring machines that could turn heat into a weapon. The spa looked clean and professional, and nothing about the reception area suggested risk. I signed in, paid for a 15-minute tanning session, and followed the hallway to a private room where the bed was already warmed up. The staff member who prepared it did not introduce herself, and I did not pay attention to the name tag. I lay inside the tanning bed, pulled the lid down, and pressed start. The digital timer began counting down from 15 minutes, and the warmth felt normal at first. The fans hummed quietly, and I tried to relax. Somewhere behind a tinted glass window, Mara saw my name on the schedule and leaned forward to confirm it was me. She had access to the system that controlled temperature, ventilation, and timer overrides. And she understood exactly how far she could push things before triggering automatic shutdown. Inside the bed, I had no idea she was watching. The first minute felt routine, and I kept my eyes closed behind the protective goggles while the heat spread evenly across my skin. Then I noticed the hum deepened slightly, and the warmth increased in a way that did not feel programmed. I opened my eyes and reached for the emergency stop button to test it. The button clicked, but the lights stayed on. I pressed it again, holding it down longer this time, yet nothing changed. The heat continued to rise in steady increments, and I pushed against the lid with both hands, expecting it to lift easily. It did not move at all, and the hinge felt locked from outside. I shouted toward the door, explaining clearly that the machine was malfunctioning and that I needed assistance. My voice echoed back at me, and the enclosed space amplified the sound of my breathing as the air grew hotter. The temperature crossed from uncomfortable to painful, and my back began to burn where it touched the surface. In the control room, Mara adjusted the settings manually, overriding the safety limits. She watched me on the monitor as I tried to sit up and failed to create space between my body and the heated surface. The heat increased again, and my chest tightened from the lack of ventilation. I tried to slow my breathing, but the air inside felt trapped and heavy. I pounded the lid with my fist and shouted louder, making sure anyone outside could hear the panic in my voice. Footsteps approached the hallway outside my room, and I yelled that I was being burnt and that the machine would not shut off. A man's voice asked if everything was okay, and I felt relief because someone had noticed the urgency in my tone. Before he could open the door, another voice answered him in a controlled, steady manner that I recognized instantly. Mara told him that I had requested a higher intensity session and that strong reactions were normal. Her voice was calm, almost clinical, and she did not raise it. I shouted her name so the man would understand this was personal and not technical. The temperature inside the bed surged again, and the pain across my arms and face sharpened into something constant and aggressive. I tried to turn onto my side, but the lid pressed down firmly, limiting movement. The man outside hesitated, and I could hear doubt in his breathing as he stood near the door. I kept speaking clearly and loudly, explaining that the emergency stop was not working and that I could not open the lid. The heat intensified further, and my skin felt tight and swollen. Mara's tone changed slightly as she insisted that interference could cause injury, which was meant to intimidate him into backing off. Inside the bed, I felt lightheaded from the heat and forced myself to keep talking so that I would not lose consciousness. The man knocked on the door harder and demanded that it be opened immediately. Mara responded more sharply now, accusing him of overreacting and interfering with staff procedures. The tension in their voices rose, and I understood that he was deciding whether to trust her explanation. Inside, the temperature reached a level that made it difficult to think clearly. My skin burned across my back, shoulders, and face, and I could smell heated plastic mixed with something metallic. I tried again to push the lid upward with both arms, but it did not shift even slightly. The man stopped arguing and slammed his shoulder against the door. The first impact shook the frame but did not break it. Mara raised her voice and told him to step away, but he hit the door again, harder this time. On the third impact, the door cracked and burst open. He rushed inside and saw the machine glowing at a level that was clearly unsafe. He shouted that it needed to be turned off immediately, and I heard movement near the control panel as objects fell to the floor. The bed continued humming at full intensity while they struggled near the controls. He pulled the main power cord from the wall, causing sparks to flash near the outlet. The lights flickered violently before shutting down, and the lid released with a mechanical click. When I touched my face, the skin felt swollen and uneven under my fingers. My arms were red and blistered, and the man who had opened the bed stepped back in shock when he saw the damage. He immediately called for help while keeping his body between me and Mara. She stood there near the control panel, breathing faster now, and insisted that she was trying to prove that we were still connected. Her explanation sounded desperate and unstable, and it became clear to everyone in the room that this was not an accident. Paramedics arrived quickly and began treating the burns while asking how long I had been inside. They covered my body with sterile sheets and administered medication for pain, which dulled the edges but did not erase the damage. Mara was restrained and removed from the room, still trying to justify what she had done. I survived, but the burns changed my face permanently. I underwent multiple procedures to repair the damage, and even after surgery, the scars remained visible. Mirrors are no longer neutral objects in my life. The spa closed after investigators confirmed that the safety systems had been manually overridden. Mara now faces charges that include attempted homicide and violation of a restraining order. The legal process is ongoing, and I have to describe the incident repeatedly in court. I was trapped inside a machine and depended entirely on a stranger who chose not to ignore my screams. If he had walked away, the outcome would have been different. What happened in that room was controlled and deliberate. I walked into that spa expecting a routine session, and I left with scars that will never fully fade. The last time I saw my daughter riding her bike, she turned at the corner near the highway and lifted her hand without looking back, and I remember thinking that I should have followed her just to make sure she was safe. That image has stayed with me longer than anything else. We went on vacation to a small coastal town that sat just off a long stretch of highway that cut through empty land before reaching the beach. The town looked peaceful and friendly, and it depended on travelers who stopped a few days before driving on. We rented a small house close enough to hear the trucks in the distance at night. On the second afternoon, she said she wanted to ride her bike along the service road that ran parallel to the highway. When the sun started to drop and the sky turned orange behind the highway signs, Tara had not returned, and my wife began checking the clock every few minutes. At first, we tried to stay calm, telling each other that she probably stopped to take photos. An hour passed, then another, and the sound of the trucks speeding along the highway became louder in the quiet evening. I called her phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail, and each unanswered call made my wife more anxious. We went to the local police station close to midnight, and the officer on duty listened with a neutral expression before explaining that they could not file a missing persons report until 24 hours had passed. He suggested that she might have left on her own or met someone passing through town, and he reminded us that young adults sometimes make impulsive decisions. The next morning, the highway looked different to me because it no longer felt like a road, but like a threat that had swallowed my daughter. My wife and I walked along parts of the shoulder where Tara liked to ride, scanning the ground carefully. Every piece of trash on the side of the road forced us to look twice, hoping and fearing at the same time that we would recognize something of hers. About 2 miles from town, near a faded highway sign, I saw something red partially hidden in dry grass. I stepped off the shoulder and walked toward it, feeling my breath grow heavier with each step as my wife called my name from behind. The front wheel was bent and the chain hung loose as if someone had forced it off. There were no skid marks on the asphalt and no sign of a car accident, which made the scene worse because it suggested that whatever happened did not involve a simple crash. A few feet away from the bike, I found her bracelet in the dirt, the same one I had given her years ago. It was not broken, just lying there like it had been placed on purpose. We called the police again and told them what we found, and they finally came to look at the site. They took photos and wrote notes, but I could see that they were careful with their words, avoiding anything that would suggest a serious crime near a highway that brought so much business into town. That afternoon, the atmosphere in our rental house shifted from fear to something darker, because we now knew that Tara had not simply decided to stay out longer. We sat at the table in silence, each lost in our own thoughts about what might have happened between the bike and wherever she was now. A knock on the door broke that silence. I walked toward the door slowly, already aware that whatever waited on the other side would not be good. An envelope lay on the porch, and inside was a Polaroid photo of Tara tied up with rope and tape over her mouth next to an old couch. We decided to act on our own. Every minute counted in our daughter's life. That night, I remembered that we had a family location app installed on our phones. I never knew how to use it, but it was time to act. Her location was still active, and that blinking dot appeared near a small cluster of houses not far from the highway, hidden behind dunes where travelers rarely stopped. I took the gun from the glove compartment and drove down the location, following a narrow road that branched off from the highway and led to a few isolated houses. The house that matched the location was small and worn, sitting close enough to the highway that passing trucks shook the thin windows. One light was on inside, and there were tire marks in the dirt that looked recent, which made my pulse quicken because it meant someone had been there not long ago. I stood outside the door listening carefully, trying to hear voices, movement, anything that would confirm she was inside. The tension built slowly as cars rushed by on the highway behind me, their headlights cutting through the dark and disappearing just as fast. When I pushed the door open, it creaked loudly and I stepped into a living room that looked ordinary at first glance. A couch, a low table, a chair tipped on its side, and on the table lay Tara's phone with the screen cracked, but still glowing faintly. I called her name more than once, moving carefully toward the hallway, and my voice sounded weak in that small place. No one answered, and the silence that followed felt deliberate, as if the house itself were holding something back. In the bedroom at the end of the hall, the bed sheets were twisted, and there were fresh footprints in the sand that had been tracked inside from the back door. I rushed outside toward the dunes behind the house, scanning the darkness for movement. The wind carried the distant noise of engines from the highway, and for a second, I thought I saw headlights moving away on a dirt path that connected back to the main road. I ran toward that path, but by the time I reached it, there was nothing except dust settling in the air. Whoever had been there had already left, and if Tara had been with them, she was now somewhere on that highway, swallowed by traffic and distance. I called the police from outside the house and told them exactly where I was, forcing my voice to stay steady even though I felt like I was losing control of the situation completely. When they arrived, they searched the house and collected the rope and tape, but their expressions told me that they were already preparing to treat this as another unresolved case. They asked why I had come alone instead of waiting for them, and I did not have a good answer that would satisfy anyone. I showed them the phone on the table and the location app that had led me there, and one officer muttered that whoever took her must have realized the phone was still active and left it behind. There were no neighbors willing to say they saw anything, even though the highway ran close enough for drivers to notice activity near the house. The officer said that with so many vehicles passing through, it would be nearly impossible to track which one might have picked someone up or forced them inside. When I returned to the rental house and told my wife that Tara had not been there, she broke down in a way that made me feel smaller than I have ever felt in my life. I had gone there believing I would bring our daughter home, and instead, I had only confirmed that she was gone and moving further away. The next morning, the local news mentioned increased patrols near the highway, but avoided using words that would scare tourists. Flyers with Tara's face began appearing near gas stations and rest stops, yet the road remained busy and indifferent, carrying strangers in and out without stopping. Months turned into years, and the highway never gave her back. We never received another photo or message, and no one ever admitted to seeing her get into a car that day. I still check online forums where people discuss disappearances along highways, reading theories that range from organized crime to random predators who look for isolated roads. None of those theories bring her closer. Tara Calico was a 19-year-old woman who disappeared in 1988 while riding her bike along a highway during what seemed like a normal summer outing. She never returned home, and months later, a Polaroid photograph surfaced showing a young woman bound and gagged, leading many to believe the girl in the image could be her. The photo intensified national attention and turned her disappearance into one of the most disturbing unresolved cases in the United States. Surrounded by conflicting witness accounts, rumors about passing vehicles, and ongoing theories that continue decades later.
I ordered the ride late at night after leaving a friend's apartment. The street was quiet, and the gray sedan waiting at the curb matched the car shown in the app. The driver's name was Diane, and the engine was already running when I approached the passenger door. The window rolled down, and a middle-aged woman leaned slightly toward me with a bright and welcoming smile. She greeted me with a cheerful tone that immediately made the situation feel relaxed.
Hey there, you must be Colin.
Yeah, that's me.
Good, hop in.
The inside of the car smelled clean and warm. Soft music played quietly while she pulled away from the curb and joined the avenue traffic. Diane began talking almost immediately, asking simple questions about work and the neighborhood. Her voice carried a natural friendliness, and she laughed easily during the conversation. The ride started like any normal trip through the city. Nothing about her behavior suggested anything strange or dangerous. The car continued down the avenue while she kept chatting in an energetic and pleasant way. At that moment, the ride felt completely normal. After several minutes, the subject of the conversation slowly shifted. Diane began talking about the people she meets while driving for Uber and how many passengers share personal stories during rides. She said people often feel lost and uncertain about their lives. Her voice became more serious while explaining these thoughts. She spoke about temptation and how the world pushes people away from the right path. Then she mentioned church. Diane explained that she volunteers every Sunday and believes faith gives people the discipline they need. The energy in her voice grew stronger while she spoke.
You know, people forget what really matters.
I looked out the window as traffic lights passed above us. What do you mean? She tightened her hands on the steering wheel before answering.
I mean, people forget God.
A few seconds later, she asked the question.
Do you believe in God, Colin?
I answered honestly. No, I'm an atheist. Her smile vanished immediately. Diane stopped speaking the moment I finished that sentence. The silence inside the car felt sudden and heavy while she kept her eyes locked on the road ahead. Her hands gripped the steering wheel much tighter than before. I waited for her to say something, but she continued driving without a single word. The calm conversation that had filled the ride earlier disappeared completely. Streetlights moved across the windshield while the engine hummed quietly. The tension in the car kept building with every passing second. I leaned forward slightly and tried to calm the situation. Hey, I didn't mean anything by that. People just believe different things. Diane still did not respond. Instead, her foot pressed down on the accelerator. The engine growled louder and the car surged forward. The sudden acceleration pushed me back into the seat while the sedan shot past a slower vehicle ahead of us. Traffic around us began reacting as Diane moved aggressively between lanes without warning. Karen slowed down a little. She did not acknowledge the request. Instead, she began speaking again with a loud and intense voice.
Luke 12:5. Fear the one who can destroy both soul and body.
Her tone sounded furious now. The friendly driver from earlier had completely disappeared. Cars around us began honking while the speedometer climbed higher. We approached an intersection where several vehicles were crossing the street. Diane never touched the brakes. We blasted through the intersection while two drivers swerved violently out of our path. My voice rose with panic. Diane stopped the car. The speedometer passed 70 miles per hour. We were still driving through city traffic. The engine roared while Diane pushed the car even faster down the avenue. Drivers behind us honked constantly while others swerved out of the way to avoid being hit. My hands trembled while gripping the door handle. Tears began running down my face while the panic fully set in. She slammed her palm against the steering wheel and screamed another verse.
The sinner cannot escape judgment.
Then I saw the wall ahead. Several blocks down the avenue stood a tall, concrete barrier surrounding an old industrial lot. The road ended directly at that wall before turning sharply to the side. Diane stared directly toward it. She never slowed down.
I know your kind. Wolves disguised as sheeps. You play good until you have the chance to corrupt people. No, I will not let that happen. You are not going to corrupt me.
The engine screamed while the speedometer climbed past 90. I leaned forward desperately while shouting, "Diane, you're going to kill us." She screamed back with violent fury.
So be it. This is God's judgment.
The wall filled the windshield. Diane never touched the brakes. The car slammed into the concrete barrier with a crushing explosion of metal. The impact felt like the world collapsing inward. The front of the car crushed instantly while the seatbelt slammed into my chest and forced the air from my lungs. For several seconds, everything around me blurred together while my ears rang loudly. When my vision slowly cleared, I could hear people shouting and running toward the wreck. Drivers had stopped along the avenue and were rushing toward the destroyed sedan. I tried to stand up and climb out. The moment my legs touched the ground, a violent pain shot through my body and forced me back down. My legs collapsed beneath me immediately. I looked down and saw my right leg bent in a direction that made no sense. Someone nearby shouted for an ambulance. My head slowly turned toward the driver's seat. Diane sat slumped forward against the steering wheel. Blood covered the front of the dashboard. Her eyes were open, and she was smiling. The doctors later told me surviving the crash had been extremely unlikely. The car had folded around the front seats during the impact. My leg was shattered in multiple places and required several surgeries before the bones could heal. Even after months of treatment, the damage remained permanent. Now I move everywhere in a wheelchair. The physical injury changed my life completely, but the memories from that ride remain just as strong. Some nights I still hear Diane shouting those verses while the engine pushed faster and faster. There is one detail about my situation that people often find strange. I still use Uber regularly, not because I want to, because traveling across the city with a wheelchair leaves very few options.
A stupid argument on Twitter turned into the worst night of my life, and it happened because I refused to shut up when I should have just walked away. A few months ago, I started seeing a woman named Alina. We were not officially a couple yet, but we spent most of our time together and things were going pretty well. One night, we were sitting at a bar and she took a photo of us smiling at the table. I posted it on Twitter without thinking much about it. About 20 minutes later, a guy named Victor Crane replied under the photo. His comment looked like a joke, but the tone was clearly meant to disrespect me. He wrote that Alina used to have better taste before, and several people started reacting to the comment like it was entertainment. I answered him because I didn't want to look weak in front of a crowd of strangers online. Victor replied again and claimed he knew Alina better than I did. The conversation turned into a public argument, while random people joined the thread to watch the fight. Eventually, he sent me a private message. The tone changed immediately because he stopped joking and started talking like he knew something I didn't. His last message that night told me that if I really trusted my girlfriend, I should check her phone. The next morning, I asked Alina if she knew Victor Kane. She told me he had messaged her months ago trying to flirt with her, but she said she blocked him because he already had a girlfriend. She sounded annoyed when she talked about him, and she told me I should just ignore the guy. I wanted to do that, but the argument was already stuck in my head. Later that day, I opened Twitter again and looked at Victor's profile. It was full of normal posts, gym photos, and pictures of him with a woman who was clearly his girlfriend. I clicked her account and started reading her posts. She looked happy and had no idea that her boyfriend was messaging other women behind her back. I sat there staring at the screen while the message box blinked in front of me. At that moment, I could have closed the page and ended the situation. I probably should have. Instead, I decided to get revenge. I sent her a message telling her that Victor had been sending photos to my girlfriend. When she didn't respond, I went back to the public thread and wrote that Victor liked flirting with other women while pretending to be loyal to his girlfriend. The reaction started almost immediately. Likes and replies kept appearing under the post, while strangers began asking questions about Victor. The attention pushed me further because it felt like people were supporting me. Victor eventually replied under the post, and his response sounded calm in a way that irritated me. He told me to relax and stop creating drama. His attitude made me even more angry because it looked like he was treating the whole thing like a joke. Instead of stopping, I tagged his girlfriend in the post so she would see it. I also tagged a few of her friends whose names appeared in her photos. The argument quickly spread beyond the two of us, and more people began digging through Victor's old tweets. He sent me another private message telling me to stop involving her in the situation. I ignored him and wrote another public post accusing him again. I kept tagging more people connected to his girlfriend because I wanted everyone to know what he was doing. Victor's next message sounded different. The calm tone disappeared and he told me I had crossed a line. He warned me that I needed to stop posting before things got worse. I didn't listen. I kept writing and tagging people while hundreds of strangers watched the argument grow. By the evening, the thread had turned into a complete mess. People who didn't even know us were arguing in the replies while others shared screenshots across the platform. Victor stopped posting publicly, which only made the situation feel stranger. I was sitting at my desk refreshing the page when a new private message from him appeared. He wrote that the online post needed to stop because the situation had already gone too far. I answered him with the same aggressive tone I'd used all day and asked what he planned to do about it. A few seconds passed before he replied again. He told me that if I really wanted to settle the argument, we should talk in person instead of hiding behind screens. Then he sent the address of an abandoned steel factory outside the city. For a moment, I stared at the message while the quiet in my apartment made the decision feel heavier than the online argument ever had. I still answered yes. I told him I'd meet him at midnight. The factory looked massive when I arrived that night. Broken windows covered the walls, and weeds had grown across the empty parking lot. I sat inside my car for a moment because the place felt much more serious than the fight we had online. Eventually, I stepped out and walked toward the entrance. The front door was already open, and the inside of the building was dark, except for a weak light hanging above in the middle of the floor. When I walked deeper into the room, I noticed something under that light. A chair stood in the center of the factory. My mother was tied to it. Her hands were bound behind the chair and tape covered her mouth. She started shaking the moment she saw me walk closer. I ran toward her without thinking. Victor stepped out from behind a large machine before I reached her. He grabbed my jacket and pulled me back hard enough to knock me to the floor. The impact made my head spin while my mother struggled against the ropes and tried to scream through the tape. Victor walked toward her slowly and pulled a knife from his pocket. He looked at me with a smile that showed how angry he had been all day. He told me that I enjoyed humiliating people online, and now I was going to understand what that felt like. Victor pressed the knife against my mother's arm while I struggled to stand up again. I shouted at him to stop, but he kicked me in the stomach and forced me back down onto the concrete floor. He reached into my pocket and threw my phone toward me. The device slid across the ground and stopped near my hand. Victor told me to pick it up and open Twitter. When I hesitated, he pushed the blade slightly into my mother's arm, and the pain made her cry through the tape. He told me to write a post saying that everything I had accused him of was a lie. My hands moved across the screen while he watched closely. I typed that I'd made the whole story up and that Victor had done nothing wrong. Then he ordered me to tag the same people again so they would see the confession. After I posted the message, Victor waited until the first replies started appearing under the thread. When he saw the reactions, he looked satisfied. He cut the ropes holding my mother's arms and stepped back and running out of the building. My mother and I left the factory as quickly as we could. We drove straight to the hospital where doctors treated the cuts on her arm and the bruises covering both of us. The police searched the building later that night, but Victor had disappeared before they arrived. By the next morning, his social media accounts were gone. The confession I posted is still online, and thousands of people believe that version of the story because they never saw what happened inside that factory. He leaned in close enough so only I could hear him, and his voice sounded calm in a way that made the threat feel worse than the knife at my throat. Next time you try to destroy someone online, remember how easily I found your family.
It was late, and I was lying on my couch scrolling through Twitter with my phone inches from my face. The room lights were on, the TV was running in the background, and I was half paying attention to anything on the screen. My feed was the usual garbage. Then a thread appeared that didn't look like the rest. The account had almost no followers. The profile picture was just a black circle. The first tweet said the thread explained how to open a demonic portal using a simple ritual anyone could perform at home. It sounded ridiculous, but it also looked detailed enough that I stopped scrolling. I tapped the thread and started reading. Each post explained a step. It talked about a glass of water, a candle, a drop of blood, and a phrase that had to be repeated several times. The thread also warned that if the ritual started, it had to be finished correctly. According to the posts, something would appear in the room if it worked. I didn't believe it for a second, but I kept reading for almost an hour anyway. The instructions were simple enough that anyone could follow them. The ritual needed a quiet room, one candle, a glass of water, and a piece of paper with a symbol drawn on it. The person performing it had to sit facing a door while repeating a phrase written in the thread. The posts insisted that the door should stay closed until the ritual ended. One tweet explained something important. If the ritual was interrupted halfway, the person had to cancel it by throwing the glass of water against the door. According to the thread, that action would shut the portal before anything crossed through it. I stared at my phone for a long moment before standing up. My apartment was small and quiet. The kitchen was a few steps away, and I grabbed a glass without thinking too much about it. Then I found a candle in a drawer and brought both things to the table in my living room. The phone stayed on the table while the thread remained open on the screen. I followed the instructions just to see what would happen. Before doing anything else, I checked the steps again. The thread warned that once the phrase started, it should not stop until the ritual finished. The candle had to stay lit. The glass of water had to remain in front of the person performing it. The door had to stay closed. I placed the glass on the table and lit the candle. The flame moved gently, but stayed steady. I took a pen from the table and pressed the tip into my fingertip just hard enough to break the skin. A drop of blood formed, and I let it fall into the glass of water. The red color spread slowly through the liquid. Then I sat down facing the door. Before I began speaking, something in the room made me hesitate. The TV suddenly lost signal and the screen turned black. The apartment became quiet in a way that felt strange because the television had been running all night. The only light left in the room came from the candle on the table. I looked at the phone again and began repeating the phrase written in the thread. The words sounded strange, but simple enough to say. After the third repetition, the lights in the apartment shut off at the same time. The candle flame jumped suddenly and leaned sideways as if someone had blown air toward it. In the kitchen, a cabinet door slammed open so hard it bounced off the wall. A plate fell from inside the cabinet and shattered on the floor. I stopped speaking for a second and stared toward the kitchen. The thread on my phone showed the next message. It said that if objects started moving, the ritual had already begun working. I looked around the room carefully before continuing. The hallway door leading to my bedroom was closed. The front door of the apartment was still shut exactly the way it had been earlier. Nothing was moving now, but the broken plate in the kitchen was clearly visible on the floor. I read the next tweet in the thread. It warned that something would appear behind the person performing the ritual. The instructions said not to look at it directly until the ritual finished. According to the post, looking too soon could provoke it. My eyes stayed locked on the door in front of me. Before anything else happened, the room became completely silent again. Even the faint sound of traffic outside had disappeared. The candle flame flickered hard and bent sideways, then the front door unlocked by itself. The handle turned slowly and the door swung open with a long creaking sound. Cold air moved through the apartment and pushed the candle flame almost flat. At the same time, something heavy slid across the kitchen counter. Another plate lifted from the counter and flew across the room. It smashed against the wall near my shoulder, and pieces of ceramic scattered across the floor. I forced myself to keep repeating the phrase, The thread said stopping too early would be dangerous. Behind my chair, something touched the floor with a soft step. I kept my eyes on the door while the steps behind me continued. Each step sounded slow and heavy. Whatever was behind me dragged its feet slightly across the floor before taking the next step forward. The sound got closer until it was directly behind my chair. The candle flame began shaking violently. I could see a shadow stretching across the table, but the shape didn't match anything in the room. It looked tall and uneven, with long arms hanging too close to the ground. Before turning around, I looked at the phone again. The thread said the ritual ended when the phrase was spoken for the final time. It also repeated the warning about the glass. If something tried to attack before the ritual finished, the person had to break the glass against the door. Something cold touched the back of my neck. I turned around quickly. The figure standing behind me was tall enough that its head nearly touched the ceiling. Its body looked like thick black smoke held together in the shape of a person. The arms were long and thin, and the fingers were stretched like wires. The face had no eyes or mouth. It leaned closer to me slowly. One of its arms lifted and reached toward my shoulder. I grabbed the glass of water with both hands. The figure moved faster the moment I touched the glass. Its arm shot forward and grabbed the back of my shirt, pulling me hard against the table. The candle fell over and rolled across the surface, while the flame kept burning sideways. I tried to pull away, but the grip on my shirt tightened. The figure dragged me halfway across the table and knocked the phone onto the floor. The screen cracked, but the Twitter thread was still visible for a second before the phone slid under the chair. Its other hand reached toward my throat. I swung the glass as hard as I could and threw it at the door. The glass smashed against the wood with a loud crack. Water and blood splashed across the surface and ran down the door in dark streaks. At the exact moment the glass broke, every light in the apartment turned back on. The figure disappeared instantly. I stood there breathing hard while staring at the door. The glass fragments were scattered across the floor. Water dripped down the wood and pooled near the base of the door. For a moment, everything looked normal again. Then I noticed the stain. A large, black mark had spread across the door where the water hit it. The shape looked like smoke burned into the wood. I wiped it with my sleeve, but the stain didn't move at all. It stayed exactly the same. The apartment was quiet again, but the kitchen was a mess. Broken plates covered the floor and one cabinet door hung open. The candle had rolled off the table and left wax smeared across the wood. I picked up my phone and opened Twitter. The thread was gone. The page showed an error message, and the account that posted it no longer existed. I searched for the username, the ritual, and the exact words from the tweets. Nothing appeared. It was like the entire thread had been erased. That happened 8 months ago. The black stain on my door is still there. I tried scrubbing it, sanding the wood, even painting over it. Every time the paint dries, the same black shape shows through again. It never fades. I also noticed something else. Late at night, when the apartment is quiet, the door handle moves slightly on its own. It doesn't open completely, but it turns slowly as if something on the other side is testing it. And sometimes I hear a dragging step behind me while I sit at the table.
The moment I saw the photo, I knew something in my life had just broken in a way that would not be easy to fix. A coworker sent me a message late at night, asking if my Twitter account had been hacked, and when I asked what he meant, he did not explain anything in words because he simply sent a screenshot instead. The image opened on my phone, and for several seconds I stared at it without understanding what I was looking at, because the woman in the photo was completely naked, and yet the face looking straight into the camera was clearly mine. The lighting in the image matched a selfie I had posted months earlier while drinking coffee in my kitchen before work, which meant someone had taken that harmless photo and fed it into an AI program that could generate a full body. The result looked disturbingly real, and the longer I examined the details, the more obvious it became that this was not a clumsy edit made for a joke. The image had been posted on Twitter by an account I had never seen before, and beneath the post, dozens of strangers were already commenting about my body and asking the account owner if there were more photos available. The account that posted the image was called @Velvet Archive, and when I opened the profile, I discovered that it looked like a store selling hundreds of similar photos of different women. Every post followed the same pattern because the image showed a woman whose face had clearly been taken from social media, while the caption advertised full AI sets that could be purchased through direct messages. My photo had already been shared several times, and the replies were full of people asking for additional angles or offering money for more images. Some users were even discussing the fake photos as if I had willingly posed for them, which made the situation feel even more humiliating, because none of them seemed to care that the woman in the picture was a real person with a real life. Later that night, a stranger sent me a direct message that immediately made the situation worse.
If you want those photos removed, you should talk to the man who made them.
A second message arrived right after the first one. The message contained the username of my ex-boyfriend. When I saw the account name, my first reaction was disbelief, because the breakup between us had been unpleasant, but not violent enough to make me expect something like this. I sent him a message asking directly if he had created the photos, and I waited several minutes while watching the conversation window on my screen. Eventually, he replied with a sentence that made the situation instantly real.
People online pay good money for content that looks real.
I told him to delete everything immediately because the images were spreading and people had already started sending them to my work email. His response came a few minutes later, and the tone of his message sounded almost bored.
It does not matter if I delete them now because the buyers already downloaded the sets.
The next day, the consequences became impossible to ignore because someone sent the photos directly to the company where I worked. My manager called me into her office and explained that the situation had reached the Human Resources Department, which meant the company wanted me to stay home while they reviewed the situation. Walking out of the building that afternoon felt like watching my normal life collapse piece by piece. The harassment online kept getting worse, and strangers began sending messages asking if I was the woman from the images they had purchased. After several days of panic and anger, I decided to confront Nolan in person, because arguing through messages was clearly not going to stop him. When he opened the door to his apartment, he looked irritated, instead of ashamed, which immediately made the argument louder than I expected. "You used my face to sell fake porn online." He leaned against the doorframe and answered in a voice that sounded defensive rather than guilty.
You disappeared from my life without explanation, so I decided to make sure you would notice me again.
Our voices grew louder while we argued in the hallway, and several neighbors opened their doors to watch while the conversation turned into shouting. During that moment, I noticed a man standing near the stairwell who had clearly been listening to the entire argument. The man said nothing and did not move closer, yet he continued watching both of us with quiet attention. That made me uncomfortable. Eventually, the argument ended, and I left the building, while the man walked down the stairs and disappeared outside. At that time, I assumed he was just another curious neighbor who had been drawn to the noise. I was completely wrong. 2 days later, I saw the same man again while leaving a grocery store near my apartment. He was standing beside a parked car across the street, and he was looking directly at me without even pretending to hide it. That same night, I received a message from a Twitter account named Collector47, and the first thing he wrote immediately confirmed what I had already started to fear.
"I bought the full image set that Nolan sold."
I told him to stop contacting me, but he continued sending messages that felt disturbingly calm.
"The pictures were interesting, but seeing you in person was better."
A few minutes later, another message arrived containing a photo that made my chest tighten because the image showed Nolan and me arguing in the hallway outside his apartment. The photo had clearly been taken from the street.
"I did not like the way he spoke to you."
Later that night, Nolan called me sounding nervous in a way that I had never heard before. He told me that someone had been sending him strange messages about the photos and demanding that he apologize for what he had done. While we were speaking, I heard a loud noise through the phone, followed by Nolan shouting at someone inside his apartment. Then the call suddenly ended. The next morning, I woke up to an email from an address I did not recognize, and the subject line contained a single word that immediately made me uneasy. Delivery. When I opened the message, the photo attached to the email showed Nolan lying on the floor of his apartment with blood spreading across the kitchen tiles. Under the image, there was a short message. "He will not sell your photos again." At the bottom of the email, the sender signed the message with the same username I had seen the night before. Collector47. Another email arrived the next day containing a second photo that showed one of Nolan's severed hands placed on a kitchen table. The message below the image simply read, "More emails followed during the next days. Each one contained another body part. Each message carried the same signature. The police contacted me after my ex's neighbors reported a terrible smell coming from his apartment, and investigators asked many questions about our relationship and the harassment connected to the fake images. I explained everything about the Twitter account, the AI photos, and the man who had begun messaging both of us online. They wrote down the information and promised to investigate the digital accounts involved. Yet the process moved slowly because the profiles had already disappeared from the platform. The emails eventually stopped, and for a while I believed the situation might finally be over. Months later, I opened Twitter again because curiosity slowly replaced fear. Before searching my name, I sat quietly at my desk, wondering if the images were still circulating somewhere online. The search results appeared on the screen a few seconds later. The account at Velvet Archive was gone. But another account appeared instead. The username was Collector47. The newest post had been uploaded only minutes earlier, and the image attached to the tweet showed me walking down my street earlier that afternoon. The caption beneath the photo contained a short sentence that made the entire nightmare start again.
I am still collecting.
I was 33 years old, broke and dragging myself through 12-hour warehouse shifts that barely covered rent and food. When my landlord raised the price again, I had no savings and nowhere else to go, so I started searching for anything cheap enough to survive another month. That is how I found her boarding house. The place did not match the price. The porch was clean, the paint was fresh, and inside everything felt warm and organized. It looked like a home someone cared about, not a rundown rental for people at the bottom. Mrs. Klein, let's call her like that, greeted me with a calm voice and steady eye contact, and she offered a rent so low that I almost corrected her because it felt like a mistake. Instead of questioning it, I convinced myself she was simply kind and maybe too trusting. I even felt guilty paying so little, but my life was already unstable, and I needed somewhere to sleep, so I ignored the doubt and moved in that same week. The first days were peaceful. She brought warm meals to my room, asked about my job, and listened carefully when I talked about money and stress. After months of feeling invisible, having someone pay attention to me felt good. Then my body started to fail slowly and without warning. I woke up with headaches that did not go away, and my legs felt weak even after a full night of sleep. At work, I struggled to lift boxes that had never been a problem before, and my supervisor warned me that I looked unstable. When I mentioned feeling depressed and exhausted, she handed me a bottle of pills and told me they would help stabilize my mood while I recovered. I started taking them every day with the meals she brought. Within a week, I could barely stand for long periods, and after missing shifts, I was fired without discussion. I expected her to demand rent I could not pay, but instead she told me to stay and recover. She said that when I was better, I could help her manage the house because she was too old to handle everything alone. And that idea gave me a dangerous sense of hope. My condition worsened quickly, and by the third week I was spending most of my time in bed because my arms and legs felt heavy and unreliable. I struggled to hold a glass without shaking, and walking across the room required focus and effort that left me exhausted. She increased the pills and insisted that the adjustment period could be difficult. My friend Daniel visited after I stopped answering his calls, and the moment he saw me, he looked alarmed. He picked up the pill bottle, studied the label carefully, and asked who prescribed it. I told him she had some left from a relative and that she was helping me, but he did not seem convinced. When she left the room, Daniel leaned closer and lowered his voice. He explained that the medication name did not match typical antidepressants, and that the dosage looked wrong. Before leaving, he slipped a few pills into his pocket and told me he would check them because something felt off to him. That night, while I was lying awake, I heard a slow dragging sound in the hallway. It was heavy and uneven, as if something wrapped in thick fabric was being pulled across the floor. The sound paused outside my door for several seconds, and I found myself listening carefully, unable to ignore it. The next morning, I collapsed on the way to the bathroom because my legs stopped supporting me. She appeared almost immediately, watching me struggle on the floor before helping me back to bed. Her tone had changed slightly when she told me I needed to rest because I was almost ready, and the way she said it made my fear begin to grow. I noticed that she watched me closely every time I swallowed the pills, and her patience no longer felt comforting but controlled. I started to pay attention to small details I had ignored before. That afternoon, I heard the backyard gate open with a metallic click, followed by the distinct sound of a shovel breaking soil. The digging continued steadily for several minutes, and it did not match casual gardening. The rhythm was deliberate and methodical. I forced myself off the bed and crawled to the window using my forearms because my legs would not respond. When I finally looked outside, I saw her near the fence digging into a patch of darker soil that looked recently disturbed. She was focused and calm, as if completing a routine task. As I pulled myself away from the window, the bedroom door opened without warning. She stood there holding a coil of rope, and her expression was no longer gentle. There was no confusion or apology in her face, only intent.
It will be easier if you stay still.
There was a moment of stillness before she moved, and in that pause I understood clearly that I was in real danger. I tried to push myself backward across the floor, but my arms were too weak to create distance, and my body responded slowly. She crossed the room quickly and grabbed my wrists with firm control. I attempted to twist away, but my strength was almost gone, and she forced my arms behind my back while tightening the rope until my fingers lost sensation. I tried to call out for help, but my voice came out strained and fragile. She secured my ankles next, pulling the rope tight enough to cause sharp pain as it pressed into my skin. I moved my legs in resistance, but the motion was weak and ineffective. Her movements were efficient and practiced, and she did not hesitate.
You have stayed long enough.
She rolled me onto the carpet and began wrapping it around my body from the feet upward. I tried to shift my weight and roll away, but she pressed her knee into my side and continued wrapping until my arms were pinned and my chest felt compressed. Breathing became difficult as the layers tightened around me. She dragged me across the hallway, and my shoulder hit the wall hard enough to make my vision blur. Each step down the stairs caused my body to strike the wood with force, and I felt every impact because I remained fully conscious. When we reached the basement, the air felt colder and damp, and she pulled me across concrete until I stopped beside something solid. Through a narrow gap near my face, I saw another shape wrapped exactly like me. The outline was clearly human, and the realization that I was lying next to a body triggered a deep and focused fear that made my breathing uneven. I remained there for hours, struggling to control my breathing as the air inside the carpet grew thinner. I could hear her footsteps above me, then the back door opening again, followed by the distant sound of digging in the yard. Eventually, loud pounding shook the front door upstairs, and voices shouted commands with urgency. Furniture crashed, footsteps ran across the floor, and someone ordered her to get down. For the first time, I heard tension in her voice as she responded. Moments later, rapid steps descended the basement stairs, and hands tore at the carpet around me. A knife cut through the rope binding my wrists, and when the fabric was pulled away, I inhaled deeply as fresh air filled my lungs. Daniel stood nearby, pale and furious, explaining to officers that the pills were not antidepressants but drugs designed to weaken me gradually. Police uncovered more wrapped bodies in the basement and began digging in the yard, revealing shallow graves that confirmed a pattern of calculated killings. I survived because Daniel trusted his instinct and went to the police as soon as he confirmed the medication was wrong. Doctors later explained that the combination of drugs in my system would have shut down my organs within days if it had continued. Investigators identified multiple victims buried in the backyard, most of them tenants with limited family contact and financial struggles. They had been selected because they were vulnerable and unlikely to be searched for immediately. I often think about how easily I accepted comfort without questioning the cost. I needed stability so badly that I ignored warning signs and convinced myself that kindness explained everything. That house felt like rescue when I walked in, but it was designed to quietly remove people who had nowhere else to go. Dorothea Puente was an elderly woman who ran a boarding house in Sacramento and presented herself as kind, generous, and protective toward her tenants, many of whom were elderly, disabled, or struggling financially. Behind that calm and grandmotherly image, she murdered several vulnerable residents, forged checks to collect their benefits, and buried their bodies in the backyard of the very home where she offered them shelter.
If you think a rental girlfriend only deals with awkward dinners and fake anniversaries, you have no idea how fast the line between acting and danger can disappear. I have worked in Tokyo for 4 years in a company that rents companionship to men who feel alone, and most of the time it felt controlled, structured, and safe. There were rules, clear time limits, and strict boundaries that protected both sides. Most of my clients were local men who wanted someone to talk to, someone to sit across from them at dinner and pretend that there was something real for a few hours. I knew how to smile at the right time, how to listen without encouraging attachment, and how to leave without confusion. It was emotional labor, but it paid well and allowed me to live comfortably on my own. I never shared my address, never mixed private life with work, and never allowed clients to follow me home. Contrary to what everyone thinks, it's a job I really enjoyed. Most of the clients were very nice, just lonely men who wanted to share their time. I enjoyed the dates, and the pay was very good, but after what happened a year ago, I no longer enjoy it as I used to. It's just a job I do mechanically for the money. It all started when I was hired by a tourist from Europe. He was confident and loud in a way that stood out immediately. During our first booking, he touched my lower back too often and asked questions that leaned too personal, but nothing crossed a line that I could officially report. I kept redirecting the conversation, and he kept smiling as if he enjoyed testing how far he could go. He booked me again, then again a third time. On that third date, he leaned forward and said he wanted to extend the experience into something more real, not physically, but emotionally. He wanted me to act like a girlfriend, but not in a conventional way. He asked for jealousy, public arguments, and tears because he wanted to feel like I truly cared. I want it messy and believable. I want you to fight for me like I matter. It was unusual, but technically allowed, since some clients requested dramatic scenarios. I agreed carefully, believing I could manage it as performance. But he was not performing. During the next meeting, he suggested we stage an argument in a cafe, and although I felt uneasy, I convinced myself it was still within the service. We sat across from each other, and without warning, he accused me of flirting with another man behind him. His voice rose sharply, and people nearby began to stare. "Why are you smiling at him? Lower your voice, please. Don't tell me how to react." His tone carried real anger. When he grabbed my wrist under the table, his grip was firm enough to hurt, and I had to pull free while keeping my expression steady to avoid making the situation worse. He stared at me with open frustration and said I was not acting correctly. I reported him after that meeting, and the company issued a warning. He responded with an apology and tried to book me again, but I refused. I believed ending contact would solve it. 2 days later, I saw him standing near my train station waiting for me. I had never told him where I lived, and the fact that he found that location made my body tense in a way I could not hide. "You are no longer my client, and you need to leave. Couples meet outside of work, right?" When I told him I would report him as unwanted contact, his expression shifted from charm to irritation instantly, and he left. A week passed, and I tried to return to normal work routines. Then, during a booking at a shopping center, I heard his voice behind me while I was speaking with another client. The sound made my heart race because I knew immediately who it was. He approached us without hesitation. "So this is how you replace me? You are mistaken and you must leave." Security escorted him out, but he never raised his voice or struggled. He kept staring at me while being led away as if memorizing my reaction. That night I checked my lock several times and went to bed later than usual. I left a lamp on because total darkness felt unbearable. I told myself I was safe and that he would return to his country soon. During the night I woke up because something warm moved slowly across my foot. At first I assumed it was part of a dream, but the sensation continued deliberate and wet, and that forced my eyes fully open. He was crouched at the end of my bed, holding my ankles while dragging his tongue along the sole of my foot. I screamed immediately and the sound echoed in the small room. "I like your skin." "Get out of my apartment right now! I'm going to call the police!" "My vacation here ends soon and I wanted to say goodbye." I kicked his face hard with my free foot, and his head snapped slightly to the side, but he didn't attack me. He stood up calmly, wiped his mouth, and walked toward the door as if leaving after a normal visit. I followed him into the hallway shouting for help, but he was already descending the stairs without rushing. I called the police right away, and they searched my apartment for signs of forced entry, but nothing was broken. That detail made the situation feel worse because it meant he had planned carefully and likely observed my routines long before that night. When they contacted his hotel, they confirmed he had already checked out. For several days, I stopped working because stepping outside felt unsafe. 3 nights later, I received an email from an unknown address with the subject line, "One more scene." When I opened it, there was a single sentence telling me I had forgotten to act scared. Attached was a photo of me asleep in my bed taken from inside my room. That image confirmed he had been there longer than I realized. I contacted the police again, and they traced the email to airport Wi-Fi used shortly before an international departure. Soon after, my phone rang from an international number. "You were supposed to love me." After blocking the number, I sat on the floor trying to steady my breathing. Authorities later confirmed he had returned to Europe and there were no further legal steps available without continued contact. Over the next month, there were no more calls or emails, and although that silence suggested he had moved on, I could not relax fully. I transferred to another branch of the company, changed my phone number, and moved to a different apartment in another district. Before leaving my old place, I checked every corner and closet carefully, even though I knew he was gone. The police informed me there were no new incidents connected to him, and officially the case was considered inactive. The conflict ended because he left the country, not because he understood boundaries or accepted responsibility. Distance became the only barrier between us. I still work as a rental girlfriend, but I use a different name and keep stricter limits than before. I never allow clients to follow me beyond agreed locations, and I pay close attention to any request that shifts from fantasy into control. Most clients remain respectful, and I remind myself that not everyone confuses performance with ownership. Even though I sleep with a light on and keep my phone within reach at night.
For as long as I can remember and for the majority of my adult life, I've been on the road for multiple hours every day. Just like everyone else, I have places to go, people to meet, and things to do. But no matter how routine the drive feels, people lose their lives every day on these roads, and honestly, that thought has always unsettled me. So I made it a rule of mine when I first started driving to be as careful as possible when on the road. I follow the laws, pay attention to the signs, and never put speed over my safety and the safety of others. But on December 30th, 2024, I learned the harsh truth that no amount of caution matters when the strangers you share the road with decide they're going to kill you. My name is Andrew Hayes, and by the time the incident happened, I had been working as an Uber driver for about 4 years and saving up money to start my own business. That day started off as just another shift for me. I had dropped off a passenger named Blair and was on my way back to the next pickup when I noticed things started to get a little strange. It all started about 4 minutes into the drive when I came up behind a white RAV4 with a unique license plate that caught my attention and read, "In Hell." I stayed behind the same car on the road for the next 5 minutes when the car suddenly started moving frantically from left to right. Concerned, I slowed down and backed off a little, as I figured the driver was either having difficulties controlling the wheel or was drunk. After a while, the car went back to normal, and as I sped up to close the distance between us, the car stopped abruptly. I quickly hit my brakes, stopping just inches away, my heart in my mouth. My initial reaction was concern, as we were both stopped in the middle of oncoming traffic, and a part of me wanted to get down to check on the driver ahead and make sure they were all right. Before I made that mistake, however, the driver revealed his true intentions, and I immediately realized that I didn't need to be checking on him, but getting as far away as possible. The white car hit reverse in an attempt to crash into me, but I backed up and dialed the cops quickly. "Police, how may I help you today?" "Hello, police? Yes, someone's trying to back up into me on the highway." The officer began asking multiple questions as I tried to explain that the man was reversing towards me at high speeds, going the opposite way of traffic. As I was explaining, though, the car ahead stopped, and I put enough distance between us thinking he was going to go away. Sadly, I was wrong. I watched in horror as the driver turned his car around and slammed the accelerator and charged towards me head on. Nothing about what he was doing made any sense, so in panic, I explained what was happening to the police officer on the phone while backing away from the car and deeper into traffic. This didn't last very long, however, and soon enough, his car smashed into mine, and he began to steer me towards the bridge and into the other cars headed our way. After seeing car after car swerve past us and missing me by just an inch, a part of me accepted the fact that I was going to die that morning. Even though I could hear the police officer asking questions in the background, my mind wasn't there, and I found myself constantly asking why this person was doing what he was doing. Eventually, however, I snapped back into reality as the officer said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to answer me if you want to stay alive. Can you confirm where you are for me?" At that point, I realized they already had officers on the way, and all I needed to do was buy some time for them to arrive. I began looking around frantically, trying to figure out what to do when I noticed we were now very close to the side of the bridge. If we crashed into that, he wouldn't be able to steer me out using his car. I knew it was a crazy attempt, but it was also the only plan I had at the time. So I grabbed the wheel, backed away to give myself a little leverage from him, and turned, slamming into the side of the bridge. Once I did that, my car stopped moving back as expected, and the other car was now at my side instead of in front, giving me the first opportunity to look at the face of the maniac behind the wheel. The woman I saw across from me was a brunette in her late 40s, with tattoos all over her face, screaming at me. My eyes stayed fixed on her as she screamed and cursed at me while spitting and foaming at the mouth. She looked rabid, like a dog, and during all this, I screamed and panicked. But the moment I saw the space in front of me open up a little, I hit the gas and began speeding towards the police station downtown, forgetting all of the safety precautions I thought I would always have. My foot remained on the gas as I sped down the highway and explained what was happening to the officer on call. This was when I glanced in my side mirror to see the white RAV4 barreling towards me still, and my heart pounded out my chest. I knew this was the final stretch of madness, and if she caught up to me, I was dead. In about 3 minutes, I was off the highway and in downtown Ontario. I felt a sudden sense of calm, as I knew this had increased my chances of survival by a lot. But just as I was about to let out a sigh of relief, my whole body jolted forward from the force of her car smashing into mine. My head slammed into the dashboard just as the airbag exploded into my chest, forcing the breath out of me. My vision blurred as the car spun out of control. Tires screeched against the slick pavement, and before I could even process what was happening, I was in the air, and my vehicle flew straight through the front of a McDonald's. I heard and felt glass shatter, and the last thing I remember were screams as tables and chairs flew in every direction. After that, it all faded, and all that was left were the blaring sounds of distant sirens coming towards the chaos. In the weeks that followed, I went through both mental and physical therapy, as I had lost some function in my legs after the incident. The crazed driver was a woman named Sasha Barton, an ex-convict with no real reason for doing what she did other than crazy theories like I had been following her and stalking her for weeks. Truth is, I had never seen that woman a day in my life before the incident. But I've been carrying her around ever since, as well as the other 2 casualties from the McDonald's incident that I'll never stop feeling responsible for. Sasha was sentenced to life in prison, and although it's just been a couple of months since, I don't think I'll ever forget that afternoon on the highway. So I hope you take this as a warning and remember that everyday trips, visits to friends, and quick grocery runs feel routine. But the roads you trust are shared with strangers who can change your life in an instant. I was careful. I followed the rules. It didn't matter. Remember the next time you drive, because one day, a stranger might decide your fate, like Sasha decided mine. This story is partially based on real events and footage that occurred on Highway 11 in northern Ontario on December 30th, 2024. The event was taken down as an extreme case of road rage as a man attacked his victim for no apparent reason, slamming into him multiple times before proceeding to chase him through the highway traffic and running him off the road. This case should be taken as a reminder of just how volatile strangers on the road can be, and a grieving reminder that you can prepare for it all, but not for situations like these.
For years, I worked as an adult webcam model, building controlled fantasies for men who wanted attention more than anything else. I understood the psychology of loneliness, and I knew exactly how to make someone feel chosen without ever promising anything real. It was business, and I treated it like strategy, not romance. I kept my private life hidden behind layers of fake names, separate accounts, and strict boundaries. Most clients were predictable once you learned their rhythm because they wanted comfort and validation in exchange for money. They projected feelings onto me, and I mirrored back what kept them paying. When sessions ended, the connection ended too, and that rule kept everything clean. Grant was the first man who treated the fantasy as a blueprint. At the beginning, he was generous, calm, and attentive, and I ranked him as one of my best clients because he tipped without hesitation. He stayed online longer than anyone else and asked thoughtful questions that made him seem invested. I gave him special attention because he paid for it, and I believed I was in control of the dynamic. I was wrong. Grant started asking about my life outside the platform. He wanted to know where I shopped, what neighborhoods I liked, and which cafes I preferred. I deflected most of it, but he persisted gently, always softening his curiosity with another large tip. One night, he described the exact pair of shoes I had bought earlier that day, including the color and brand, and he suggested another model from the same store that he claimed would suit me better. When I asked how he knew, he told me it was coincidence and that he had simply been nearby. I told him clearly that he was crossing a line and that he should never reference my offline life again. He apologized quickly and sent a significant payment, insisting he only mentioned it because he cared. I accepted the apology because the financial incentive made it easier to rationalize the discomfort. The tension escalated when he discovered I had a boyfriend, information I had never shared publicly. During one session, he demanded reassurance that I was loyal to him, and when I avoided the question, his messages turned sharp and possessive. I ended the session and blocked him, assuming distance would cool whatever attachment he had built in his head. 2 weeks passed without contact, and I began to believe the situation had ended. Then a package arrived at my apartment addressed to my real name, which was never connected to my online identity. Inside, there was an expensive necklace and a handwritten letter explaining that he forgave me for lying about my boyfriend and that he trusted me completely. He wrote that we belonged together and that temporary obstacles would disappear soon. I changed passwords, updated security settings, and warned my boyfriend that someone from work might try to contact me. I did not tell him the entire truth because I felt responsible for encouraging Grant's emotional dependence. I believed technical barriers would slow him down. Instead, flowers were delivered to my mother's house with a letter asking permission to marry her daughter. My mother called me confused and unsettled, and I drove there immediately to her house. In the letter, he described future plans with specific details about where we would live and how he would provide for me. Emails continued from new accounts, alternating between apologies and declarations of ownership. Eventually, he wrote that he was tired of waiting and that he was ready to visit me in person. That message shifted the situation from disturbing to dangerous. Instead of going to the police, I convinced myself I could manage him by re-establishing contact under controlled conditions. In addition, the police often dismiss these cases because of the type of work involved. I logged back into the platform at our usual time, and he was already waiting as if he had been watching the clock. I told him I needed stability and reassurance if we were going to build something real. I spoke gently and framed the conversation around trust, suggesting that we could move forward if he proved commitment. He responded immediately, saying he would change his life completely and that nothing mattered more than our future together. Over several sessions, he repeated that he would do anything necessary to remove obstacles and secure our happiness. Instead of ending the relationship, I made a calculated decision driven by greed. I told him I needed a large amount of money to leave my current life and start over with him somewhere new. He did not hesitate to agree, and he said he would solve everything so that we could finally be together without interference. The certainty in his voice should have warned me. I promised him that once the money arrived, I would leave my boyfriend and dedicate myself entirely to him. After that conversation, he disappeared for several days, and the silence felt heavier than his previous obsession. I kept checking my accounts expecting a transfer notification, and instead, there was nothing. The absence of contact created a tension that sat in my chest all day. Then a news alert appeared on my phone with his full name in the headline. The article reported that a man in Florida had shot his family inside their home and attempted to stage the scene. As I read further, I saw that investigators believe it was to run away with another woman. I start panicking. My inbox contained a message sent hours before his arrest, where he wrote that everything was finally clear and that no one could prevent our happiness now. He described what he had done as necessary and claimed he had removed the people who stood in our way. He ended by saying he was coming to start our life together and hoped I would understand. Details in the reports explained that he waited until his family was asleep and carried out the shootings methodically. Reading those details forced me to confront how seriously he had taken my promise. I realized that when I told him I needed freedom and money to run away with him, he interpreted that as a command to remove anyone preventing that plan. In his mind, his family represented resistance, and he believed eliminating them was proof of devotion. That connection between my words and his actions is something I cannot erase. Detectives contacted me within days and asked direct questions about whether I had encouraged him to view his family as barriers. I explained how the platform worked and how fantasy often includes exaggerated promises, and I stated clearly that I never instructed him to hurt anyone. Even as I spoke, I understood how my messages might look in isolation. They showed me parts of his conversations where he described our future as inevitable and framed the murders as a step toward freedom. My name appeared repeatedly in his explanation of motive, and seeing that in official documents made the situation feel irreversible. Although I was not charged with a crime, the investigation tied my identity permanently to his. My accounts were frozen and my income vanished almost immediately due to the publicity. Online forums debated my responsibility, with some calling me manipulative and others labeling me a victim. Neither label captured the complexity of what happened because I had knowingly played with someone unstable for financial gain. Grant was arrested before he could leave the state, and in interviews he continued to describe his actions as sacrifices made for love. Listening to those statements made it clear that he had replaced reality with a narrative where violence was romantic. He never acknowledged that I might not share that vision. The most disturbing part is not the violence itself, but the certainty Grant expressed in his final message, because he believed he had solved a problem and expected gratitude. He imagined arriving at my door as a hero who cleared the path for our happiness. The fact that he thought I would welcome him after what he did is what still keeps me alert long after I left that life behind. Grant Amato murdered his family in January 2019 in Florida after developing an intense obsession with a webcam model. He had spent large amounts of money supporting her online, creating serious financial conflict with his family, who tried to intervene and cut off his access to funds. When the pressure escalated and his family confronted him about his behavior and spending, he shot and killed all 3 of them inside their home, later attempting to stage the scene. He was arrested shortly afterward and was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
If you want to understand how I ended up on the brink of death, you have to start with the part where success stops feeling real and starts feeling like something you must feed every day. I run a huge TikTok account built on eating things that look unsafe, disgusting, or borderline illegal. And the audience keeps growing because they're always waiting for the moment I finally go too far. At first it was fun. Then it became income, and eventually it turned into a machine that never stops asking for something worse than yesterday. Brands send me products constantly, most of them novelty foods or strange imports, and I rarely turn anything down because every video means more exposure and more deals. My apartment looks like a storage unit filled with boxes, coolers, and half-open packages, and the smell changes depending on what I filmed that week. I stopped caring about nutrition or common sense a long time ago because neither of those things trends online. So, when an unknown company offered a large payment for a short series about eating expired products on camera, I treated it like any other risky promotion and signed immediately. The contract demanded full visibility of expiration dates and no editing cuts, which sounded perfect for shock value. I didn't research them properly because the money was already in my account, and at that point caution felt like a luxury for people without deadlines. The package arrived in a plain box with heavy tape wrapped around it. Some labels were faded. Others had additional stickers placed directly over the dates, so they'd be easy to read on camera, which made the whole presentation feel deliberate. It looked less like a random assortment and more like a curated collection of things no one should eat. Before recording the first video, I held one swollen jar in my hands longer than necessary, noticing the lid bulge slightly and make a faint clicking sound when pressed. I opened it, forced a smile, and started talking to the camera, as if nothing about the situation was unusual. The smell was sharp enough to sting my nose, but I kept going because backing out after pressing record would just look weak. Once the performance begins, you feel obligated to finish, no matter how bad the idea was. About an hour after uploading the first video, my stomach started hurting in a way that made it hard to stand upright, not like normal nausea, but like something twisting deep inside. I laid on the bathroom floor sweating while my phone buzzed nonstop with comments praising my commitment, and that contrast made the pain feel more isolating because no one could see the reality behind the clip. Turning off notifications didn't help because the vibration kept echoing in my head. Before opening the second item, I sat at the table staring at the sealed container while the pain from earlier lingered in dull waves across my abdomen. I considered stopping the series, but the contract penalties were severe, and the money had already been spent on rent and equipment upgrades. Admitting failure would not only cost financially, but also damage the fearless persona that made my account valuable. The second product was a cloudy drink that released a strange hiss when opened, and the liquid inside moved sluggishly as if thicker than water. I took a cautious sip, then a larger one for the camera, and immediately felt heat spread down my throat into my chest, followed by a heavy nausea that made my head spin slightly. Even then, I kept talking, forcing enthusiasm because thousands of views were already guaranteed. That night, I woke up suddenly, sitting upright, with acid burning my throat and my heart racing fast enough to make my chest ache. I recorded a quick clip out of habit, intending to use it as bonus content, but watching it back made me uneasy because I looked genuinely frightened instead of entertaining. It was the first moment I wondered if I'd misjudged something serious. The next morning, news broke about another creator collapsing during a live stream, and I recognized him as someone who had recently posted similar expired food challenges. The report blamed stress and dehydration, yet the timing felt too close to ignore, especially since his last video showed products that looked disturbingly similar to mine. Online comments were already speculating about dangerous sponsorships. Before filming the third video, I paced around my apartment, rereading the contract and searching for any trace of the company, hoping to find reassurance that this was just an edgy marketing campaign. The absence of information felt intentional, as if whoever organized it wanted no public footprint at all. That realization made continuing feel less like work and more like participating in something hidden. The third item was preserved meat, sealed so tightly it took real effort to cut open, and the smell that escaped was strong enough to make my eyes water instantly. I leaned away from the table, breathing through my mouth to avoid gagging, but then leaned back into frame because stopping would look suspicious. Every chew felt like forcing rubber down my throat while my body resisted. Midway through the recording, a sharp pain spread across my chest and into my back, making it difficult to sit upright. Yet I kept talking because fear of losing relevance outweighed physical fear in that moment. Messages began appearing saying I looked pale and unwell, which only increased the pressure to act normal. I ended the video quickly and spent the rest of the day lying still, hoping the sensation would fade. Another smaller creator was reported unconscious in his apartment, also known for extreme food content, and the pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Discussion threads connected our recent sponsorships, pointing out how several of us had accepted deals from unknown sources offering unusually high payments. Reading those theories made my chest tighten with something closer to dread than pain. I studied my reflection in the dark screen and noticed how drained I looked compared to older videos where I seemed loud and energetic. My face appeared hollow, my lips dry, and there was a constant pressure behind my eyes that made focusing difficult. During the live stream, I displayed the remaining products and warned others about the sponsorship, explaining that something was clearly wrong. Instead of support, The chat filled with people mocking me for pretending to care only after getting paid, reminding me of past videos where I bragged about doing anything for money. That reaction made the situation feel hopeless, like I had lost credibility exactly when I needed it most. While speaking, the room began to tilt and my hands stopped cooperating, causing the table to shake as I tried to hold on to it. Breathing became shallow and uneven, and the sound of notifications merged into a loud, continuous buzz that drowned out my own voice. I slipped from the chair and hit the floor, aware that thousands were still watching but unable to move enough to stop the stream. I woke up in a hospital bed surrounded by machines, with a nurse explaining that viewers had called emergency services after seeing me collapse live. Tests showed severe inflammation, consistent with ingesting contaminated substances repeatedly over several days. Hearing that confirmed my fear that this was not a random illness, but a direct consequence of the sponsorship. Before I was allowed to use my phone, a television report mentioned influencer rivalries and suspicious deals targeting smaller competitors. Investigators revealed that the company behind the expired products functioned as a shell, with payments traced to accounts connected to a major creator in the same niche. The implication was clear, even without naming him directly.
Walked into the McDonald's where I worked. The distance I had been trying to build between my job and my home life collapsed in a matter of seconds. I had taken that job because I wanted to leave my parents' house and stand on my own. Not because we needed the money. My family was comfortable, but comfort in that house came with control, and every decision about my future was already planned without asking me what I wanted. I did not care about cleaning bathrooms or smelling like grease after a double shift, because every paycheck meant I was closer to renting a small place of my own. My father, however, saw the uniform as an insult to our last name. He said I was lowering myself, embarrassing the family, and throwing away opportunities that he had worked hard to build. The arguments became routine, and they always ended with him reminding me that he paid for everything and that I owed him obedience. One morning, he locked the front door and hid my phone so I would miss my shift, but I climbed out the kitchen window and took a bus across town anyway. My manager noticed the tension in me, but let me keep working, and that job slowly became the only space where I felt like I had a choice. The more hours I worked, the more my father escalated his pressure at home. He would wait for me in silence and then start long speeches about reputation and respect, and although he did not always shout, the threat under his words was clear. He began calling the restaurant during my shifts, demanding that I come home immediately and warning me that he would show up if I did not. My coworkers started noticing the pattern, even though I tried to act normal while taking orders and filling trays. Mateo, who worked the grill, began walking me to the bus stop after closing because he sensed something was wrong. I told him my father was strict and stubborn, but I did not explain how intense the control had become behind closed doors. The night everything broke apart started during a crowded dinner rush, when the restaurant was loud with families and blinking screens. I was behind the counter, organizing a large order, when the front doors slammed open so hard that several customers turned at once. I did not need to look up to know who had just walked in. My father moved through the restaurant with a rigid posture and a stare that made people step aside without being told. My manager approached him carefully and asked him to step outside if he needed to talk, but my father ignored the request and demanded that I come forward immediately. I walked around the counter because I did not want him climbing over it, and I tried to keep my voice steady while telling him I was working. He leaned close and told me I was done humiliating the family, and when my manager insisted that he leave or the police would be called, something in my father snapped. He grabbed a stack of trays and threw them across the floor, causing plastic to scatter and customers to rush toward the exit. The sudden violence shifted the entire room from confusion to fear. He grabbed my hair with force and dragged me out from behind the counter into the open area near the tables. I hit the floor hard, and before I could push myself up, he kicked me in the side while people screamed and pulled out their phones. He shouted that I had disgraced him and that he would not allow his daughter to work in a place like this. My manager stepped forward despite obvious fear, and Mateo moved away from the grill, watching closely for a chance to intervene. I tried to pull my father's hand away from my hair, but his grip was tight and controlled, and he forced me to my feet again. The situation shifted into something far more dangerous when my father reached into his coat pocket, and the movement drew immediate attention from everyone nearby. My manager froze mid-step, and Mateo stopped advancing, clearly unsure of what was coming next. When the handgun appeared in my father's hand, the noise inside the restaurant dropped to a stunned silence. He pointed the weapon directly at my manager and ordered everyone to back up, and the fear on their faces was immediate and real. My manager raised his hands and took slow steps backward, while customers pressed themselves against the walls. My father kept one hand twisted in my hair and used the other to aim the gun around the room. He announced that I was leaving with him, and that anyone who tried to interfere would be shot. As he began walking backward toward the exit, he dragged me with him, keeping the gun moving from one person to another to maintain control. I tried to resist by shifting my weight and slowing my steps, but he responded by pulling harder and pressing the weapon forward. Mateo spoke up and told him to let me go, and although fear was visible in his face, he did not retreat. My father answered with anger, insisting that no one had the right to question how he handled his daughter. We were only a few steps from the door when my father adjusted his grip on the gun, and that slight distraction created a narrow opening. Mateo lunged forward and wrapped his arms around my father from behind, locking his arms against his sides in an attempt to control the weapon. The struggle began instantly, with both of them slipping on the greasy floor while trying to overpower each other. I dropped to the ground and crawled several feet away because I knew I could not stand between them. My father slammed his head backward into Mateo's face, and the impact made a sharp sound that caused more panic among the customers who had not yet escaped. Mateo staggered but tightened his grip, attempting to force the gun downward toward the floor. The first shot fired into the ceiling, sending debris down and causing several people to scream. The second shot was aimed straight at Mateo's chest, and the sound felt louder than the first. Mateo's body jerked, and he took 2 unstable steps backward before collapsing near the soda machine. Blood spread across the tile quickly, and the sight of it triggered another wave of panic as customers rushed outside. I tried to move toward him, but my manager grabbed me and pulled me away because my father was still armed and turning in place. Sirens approached from outside, and 2 customers tackled my father while he was distracted, knocking him to the floor and forcing the gun from his hand. Police officers entered seconds later and restrained him as he continued shouting that he had done nothing wrong. Paramedics rushed in and began working on Mateo, while officers secured the scene and moved everyone else outside. They cut open his uniform shirt and pressed gauze against the wound while speaking urgently about blood loss. I stood near the entrance, held back by an officer, watching them try to save someone who had stepped forward to protect me. Mateo was placed on a stretcher and taken to the ambulance, and I followed until I was stopped at the sidewalk. My father was being forced into a patrol car, still yelling that he had acted to defend his family's honor. Later that night, at the police station, I learned that Mateo had died at the hospital. I gave a detailed statement about the assault, the gun, and the struggle because I needed the record to be accurate. My father was charged with multiple crimes, including murder, and his name appeared on the news within hours. I moved into a small apartment not long after, using the money I'd saved from working long shifts. I still work at the same McDonald's because leaving would feel like abandoning the place where someone risked everything for me.